Good morning. Well, it's 10 o'clock. We're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, ERCOT Board of Directors and guests. I'm Bill Flores, the Board Chair. I hereby reconvene and call to order the June 1st and 2nd, 2026 meetings of the Board of Directors. This meeting is being webcast live to the public on ERCOT's website. I would like to provide PUC Chairman Thomas Gleason the opportunity to reconvene the open meeting of the Public Utility Commission of Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This meeting of the Public Utility Commission of Texas will come to order to consider matters that have been duly posted with the Secretary of State for June 2nd, 2026.
Thank you, Chairman Gleason. The antitrust admonition and the security map are included with the meeting materials. As I indicated yesterday, the board received a request on behalf of Gideon Powell, CEO of CHOA Inc., to provide in-person comments. We will take up Mr. Powell's comments later today during our discussion of two revision requests under Agenda Item 15.1.4 regarding the batch zero process for large load interconnections. Chad, have we received any other requests for comment?
No other requests.
Okay, very good. Agenda Item 11 is first on our calendar this morning. It's our CEO update by Pablo Vegas. Pablo.
Good morning. Thank you, Chair Flores, and thank you, everybody, for your interest in the important work that we are doing at ERCOT. Today, I want to cover a few kind of strategic topics that are at the forefront of all of our conversations right now. I want to give a very, very brief discussion on the load forecast that was covered a couple times yesterday, so I'm going to try to be as non-redundant as I can on that topic. I do want to touch on the batch zero process, step back a little bit, look at kind of what it represents, what are the components of it, and where we are headed long term with this batch construct. And then I'll talk a little bit about some of the progress we've made on Senate Bill 6, what we're seeing in terms of capacity capabilities this summer, some changes since last summer. And then, as I always do, I'll finish with some thanks and recognition for some of the great work that's being done across our organization. So with regards to the long-term load forecast, as it was noted yesterday, we received in a fairly significant increase over the load forecast in 2025. It projected approximately 367,000 megawatts of peak generation by 2032, representing more than 4 times the 2026 peak of our system. This forecast consists of 2 main components. I like to always try to make sure folks understand what goes into this. There's a base forecast that we develop that is based on expected residential and commercial business growth, as well as factoring in items like rooftop solar additions and expected electric vehicle growth. That base forecast comes in at about 111,000 megawatts out of that 367,000. And then the second significant component that goes into it is the large load additions that are provided by the transmission operators that are working closely with the customers that are expressing interest in developing their sites on the ERCOT system. And that component consisted of over 250 gigawatts of that large load. As noted yesterday, we acknowledge that this is not what we expect to come online. It is too high of a figure based on realistic expectations. And I want to emphasize how critical that we get this long-term load forecast right. The load forecast is probably one of the most consequential and important data elements that we use in ERCOT for many facets of our operations and planning. We use it for resource adequacy planning. We use it for transmission planning. It is critical for outage forecasting, so being able to help transmission operators and generator operators to plan their outages in the future. And there are significant reports that are based off of that long-term load forecast. The ERCOT budget is based off of that long-term load forecast. So there are many aspects that are driven directly from this core piece of data that we need to make sure is as accurate as possible. At that May 7th Public Utility Commission where it was discussed, we discussed the preference to try to adjust that in some way. We could do it either using the historical method that we used last year, which was looking at actual realized rates of additions, or we could use something like the proposed batch zero entry criteria that is being developed today as a way to modify that. And so either one of them, I think, is going to lead to a more realistic outcome. We're still working on that with stakeholders, getting comments through the Public Utility Commission process. And so in the end, we will end up, I think, getting to a much more accurate and realistic number that is going to be very usable for the purpose of transmission planning and resource adequacy and reliability forecasting. There are some changes that we've requested as a result of that. One of those is we've requested a good cause exception to not file the May CDR report. That's our capacity, demand, and reserve report. That is based directly on what the long-term load forecast is. So without having that complete, it's not going to be a very useful report. In its place, we have instead filed an updated view, a snapshot of expected generation resource capacity. So it's the capacity side of that report, but we're not including in those filings an expectation of the load forecast or the planning reserves that would be affiliated with that. And we've also asked for an exception to not file the 2026 Regional Transmission Plan. Again, the batch process that we're now getting into is going to be dealing with creating the next iteration of a transmission plan that's going to be driving the infrastructure investments. And so we think that there's very little value in expending the resources to do that. And so both of those are under consideration and could be discussed by the Commission as early as later this month. So I'd like to spend a few minutes on the batch study process, and this has really felt like a journey in a lot of ways because it's had such intensity behind it and so much focus. But in reality, it's one of the fastest planning guide and nodal protocol revision processes that we've ever developed in the ERCOT market, and it's been done under an extremely high pressure, high scrutiny environment that has required it to be extremely thoughtful and carefully considered. The concept of this batch was formalized with the PUCT just back in December. In January, we focused time on listening to stakeholders, making sure that we could understand what the perspectives are on what would be important in a revised process on interconnecting large loads. And then a couple months later in March, which was just 3 months ago, the very first draft of the PIGR 145 was put forth for discussion. That was approved on May 19th, a couple weeks ago. Looking ahead, we've got the board discussion and approval potential for that today, and then the PUCT consideration of that in the weeks ahead. And then by August 7th, that's going to be the date by which the transmission service providers and distribution service providers are going to be notified on the specific status of their large load customers and whether it's going to, and that status basically means whether they're going to be included in the batch zero, whether they met the criteria, and if it is included, whether it has been designated as a base load project or one that is going to be considered a studied load. We'll then execute those batch load studies beginning in August, and by April 9th of next year, we're going to communicate those study results, including the amount of transmission capacity that has been allocated by year to the studied loads within batch zero. And we'll also communicate what are the needed transmission projects and improvements, as well as their expected costs. Those large load customers are going to have until June 8th to make a final commitment to proceed with those projects and to make any necessary financial security and site control requirements. I think it's really important to also to step back a little bit and think about kind of what we're doing here, because this is an issue that is affecting the whole globe and certainly the country. Everybody is trying to figure out how to do this in a reliable, stable way. And so when you think about, the last 6 months, the community of the ERCOT market across all the stakeholders, the regulatory bodies, and ERCOT itself have been working together in a very short time to set a pattern and solve a problem that is a critical energy use problem across this nation. I think when we get this done, it'll be the first step in that solution set actually being defined. It won't be perfect. There will be things that we're going to be able to improve upon it in the next batch as we define kind of the ongoing process. But I think it's important to reflect on the significance of how much of a change this actually represents in the way that the large load interconnection process is working, and that we potentially could be solving a national issue on how to do this in a way that can be done reliably, stably, with consideration for the economic growth considerations, with consideration for the cost implications, and with consideration for the reliability and stability of the grids that need these, that are going to support these assets. So the components of this, are really the key parts of what's inside of Batch Zero, and we've talked a lot about it as, just kind of the study, but really there's a few things that I want to make sure that I call out here. Obviously, most of the attention has been focused on the inclusion criteria. It's been taking up a lion's share of the discussion, which is a really key issue, defining which projects are real, which are non-speculative, that have identified customers and the resources to actually develop and to utilize the infrastructure that is going to be committed for them and built for them in a way that considers the cost prudency for ratepayers across Texas, customers across the ERCOT market to pay for, with obviously the allocation of those costs, one of the key considerations to be sure that it's done fairly and supported by those that are driving the infrastructure investments. In addition to that entry criteria, the batch process is, of course, going to consist of the core system-wide study itself. That's that kind of second tranche of work that's going to happen between August and April. It's going to consist of studying the overall transmission system and assess how it will serve the requested load and allocate the available transmission capacity that we have over the next 6 years. But it's also going to identify the needed transmission to fully meet all of the full load expectations in that batch. That's something that I think has to be said over and over again, that we focus a lot on the fact that there's going to be an allocation of transmission over the course of the 5 to 6 year period, but the end process is going to deliver a solution to serve all of it, 100% of it. And so that's why it's so critical that as we finish that and we see exactly what it's going to take, that the commitment and the expectation of those customers to move forward and to develop is certified in a way that protects all of the consumers in Texas. Because following that, there is this commitment gate where those customers are going to have to make a commitment with financial security and with the signed interconnections and with the commitments long term to utilize the infrastructure that is going to be built for them to serve 100% of what they have asked for in the Batch Zero. Following that, if there are changes to customers' expectations and plans, then there will be a refinement step that will be done, which is only going to be a retraction potentially of saying, okay, if this project or that project is not needed, then we will pull back and refine the study to make sure that only the transmission that is needed to serve all of the load that remains after that commitment gate is what is invested in and what is developed. And then finally, the output of that is going to be an actionable transmission plan that is then going to drive transmission and infrastructure investment over the next 6 years. Beyond the zero process, the Batch Zero process, we're really looking at a fundamental change going forward to how we look at doing transmission planning. We have historically had multiple pathways on being able to justify and build transmission within the ERCOT system. That has created, because of the volume and the pace of the changes that we've experienced, a very complicated situation that the Batch Zero has been designed to try to address and the ongoing batch to address. So fundamentally, what we're looking to do long-term down the road is to develop that comprehensive approach for developing transmission that'll bring together the RTP, the RPG, the batch construct, all into an integrated transmission plan so that we take a very good load forecast that's well vetted and represents exactly what we think is going to happen economically. We put together a transmission plan to serve all of that consistently, providing certainty to those customers and certainty to consumers in the state and to how we're going to develop infrastructure. And then we go ahead and build that as a result coming right out of there. And we don't have other steps along the way that make that long or protracted. And so we want to keep the efficiencies that our market is known for, being able to develop transmission faster than any place else in the nation, being able to support economic growth at a pace that no place else in this country can support. That is still a driving objective and an expectation of the revisions that we're looking at from Batch Zero and then going into Batch 1 in the long term. Let me pause there if there's any questions on the batch that have not been addressed in conversations we've had yesterday or with this.
I don't see any.
I had a quick question.
Yes.
How many gigawatts of load meet the batch criteria for both base and allocated load in at Batch Zero?
So right now, that's an evolving number because we're at the stage right now where we are still evaluating the studies that have come in from the transmission and distribution companies, making sure that we validate whether or not there's conflicting or not, and determining which are going to be base load and which are going to be studied and which meet the criteria. There's probably, I'd say, a range that if I were to give you a number today, it would probably be about 35 gigawatts or so that would probably be in that baseload definition, and maybe around 65 gigawatts that would be in that studied allocation, so close to around 100 gigawatts total in that batch zero definition. That could shift, that mix could shift, and more of that baseload could grow based on the validity of the study process that we execute over the next 6 weeks or so, leading up to that July 9th deadline. So that's about the scale size of how things are looking at this point. So it's a fairly sizable amount of load that's going to be evaluated in the batch study. Okay. I wanted to highlight the fact that there's been some progress on one of the Senate Bill 6 requirements, and that requirement is that we study and review proposed net metering arrangements that are involving large loads that are co-locating with a generating resource that is in existence as of September 1st, 2025. And this is really important to note that this whole net metering construct within Senate Bill 6 is focused on resources that are online and running at September 1st or before. Anything that is new, that is coming along with a bring your own generation concept that we hear a lot about with the new data centers that are building would not be subject to those provisions, because this law is for those that are co-locating with generating resources as of September 2025. And so as of May 2026, the PUC has approved 2 net metering arrangements that have conditions associated with it. Those conditions require the load to be able to curtail, and the co-located generation resource that it's co-located with to be able to make its capacity available to the system within 30 minutes of an ERCOT instruction in order to avoid or mitigate an actual or anticipated EEA or transmission emergency. We're going to, when practicable, ERCOT will issue public notices that if the grid conditions are tightening, that co-located facilities may need to take action, so those that fall under this provision. And then if the conditions deteriorate or do not improve, then we would be in a position to instruct the facility owners to act based on the requirements of the net metering provisions. We're going to be incorporating these instructions into a large load curtailment manager. This is, and there's going to be an NPR process that's going to describe exactly how that's going to work in order to standardize the deployment of these resources when we need to have this curtailment and we need to have generation put back on the grid. That needs to be automated, and so that we're going to be developing this curtailment manager to be able to enable that. So this is a notable advancement in a couple of the provisions of Senate Bill 6, and I just wanted to highlight that we've had 2 of those projects move forward. So looking ahead to this summer, we've seen some fairly significant additions in capacity since last summer, over almost 11,000 gigawatts of new capacity. And you can see the large majority of it continues to be with storage and solar. That's what we've seen historically over the last few years, driving most of the additions on the grid. Those make up over 9,000 megawatts of the additions. But what I want to highlight is the growing gas number that we see on this slide. We haven't seen a number of this size in an annual change in quite a few years, over 1,500 megawatts of combined natural gas and diesel. I think there was a question yesterday about how much has been supported by the TEF. Julie, I think you might have had that question. And the Texas Energy Fund is about 900 megawatts of this, of the 1,200 or so of this that is natural gas. And so it's about 3/4 of the total, driven by the TEF loan program that is out there. This also means that we're in the official summer inspection cycle right now, and so Dave Cazell, under Christie's team, they're out doing inspections, making sure that the facilities, generating and transmission facilities, are able to operate and have weatherized for the extreme heat of the summer that we expect. And so that's a really important part of our reliability process that is not just winter focused. We do it in the summer as well. And then one last quick highlight. I want to just point out that we have published 2 more reports for this summer. June and July are out. Both of them are showing fairly low chances of reliability risk or concerns. As we continue to see load growth coming on, that profile and picture obviously can evolve, and we expect it to evolve. But what we have published at this point is still showing fairly adequate capacity and low likelihood of emergency conditions going into the June and July months. And in addition, we've talked a lot in the last few board meetings about the specific support resources that we have. One example, the South Texas IROL. We have the lifecycle mobile power units that were installed around San Antonio. They are available and ready for service if they're needed this summer. So I want to just make the point that that is still an available resource for reliability purposes. And then in addition, the Bronick 3 unit, which was brought online last winter, is going to also be available, and they're available for dispatch under the reliability must-run contract that we have with them. So that's another resource that will continue to be available through this summer. I want to highlight the evolution of the Dispatchable Reliability Reserve Service, kind of where we are with that project. This is a pretty significant change. Again, this is the most significant ancillary service change that we're going to have seen since ECRS came online back in 2023. The driver for the DRRS is the statute that passed in 2023. And one of the drivers is that with any new DRRS that is purchased, procured for the purpose of providing ancillary services, will be required to reduce RUC. And so while RUCs are needed for addressing system reliability and some congestion risks, they do reduce market efficiency and they increase uplift costs. And I think Keith pointed this out yesterday. We have seen a pretty significant decrease in RUCs just because of the RTC plus B implementation, about 80% reduction in RUCs through the first quarter of this year. And this is one of the expected benefits that we expected to see coming out of RTC. We've been working collaboratively with stakeholders on the design of DRRS and to determine some of the key parameters. We've had 3 TAC-led workshops addressing major design questions this year. We've got NPRR 1309, which is the base statutory requirement of the DRRS, up for a vote in the meeting today. And we've had some major design evolutions over the last few years. Since 2023, we've updated the thinking around how DRRS could be leveraged. Right now, we've got current multiple NPRRs that are being considered to define fully the parameters and operations of how DRRS could work. One of those is NPRR 1310. 1310 defines a release factor for the Dispatchable Reliability Reserve Service that could serve as a resource adequacy support tool without making significant design market changes, just adding in a feature into that ancillary service that could be leveraged in the future if it was needed. We're going to be doing later this fall a reliability assessment that is going to look at how the ERCOT grid is positioned to meet the reliability standard that was defined a couple of years ago. And the DRRS Plus with a resource adequacy feature could be one of the potential solutions if there was a need to do something to improve the reliability standard objectives. And so that's something that will be evaluated, I think, in conjunction with as we look at the results of that reliability standard work. And there's also a question about the role of energy storage resources. So there will be another NPRR that is going to be defined to consider whether the role and the duration requirements of energy storage resources, and if that can be implemented at the same time that we would implement the Core 1309. Occasionally, I'd like to highlight a few of the research and innovation projects that we are doing in our grid organization. And today I want to highlight a large load modeling initiative and an energy storage resource optimization initiative that we've been working on. So we recently completed a large load modeling initiative with Texas A&M University. So we really need to understand the performance characteristics of large loads, especially when it comes to transmission level studies. And so what we're doing with this work with Texas A&M, these models that we've developed have helped us to understand many of the unique operating characteristics of their behavior much better. And the stability team has been able to use these models to recreate certain grid events that have occurred historically that would have been very difficult to do and to assess how it affected the grid absent having these new models. So we're going to be continuing to work with A&M in developing additional models. We plan to share those with the industry so that we can gather feedback on it and that we can continue to work together to design the requirements of our transmission system that really best reflect the unique performance of these large loads that are coming online. And another initiative that we're working on is this energy storage state of charge optimization. Battery energy storage has obviously very unique characteristics that helps it to maintain the reliability of the power system. They can respond very quickly to frequency regulation and net load balancing, but they're also limited duration. And so meaning that what a battery does now in terms of its decision to charge or to discharge right now directly affects what it can do later. So this initiative is a first step in developing tools that ensure that stored energy is going to be available for critical periods. One analysis scenario focuses on RUCs. And storage was strategically charged during periods of net load and energy preserved for discharge during a high net load or constrained period during the RUC study horizon that we did, which resulted in a much more efficient utilization of RUCs over time, because RUCs are looking at what is going to be available in a future hour, and if it can factor in the expectations around state of charge for a battery, we can be more efficient and potentially more limited in the use of RUCs during that time period. This energy storage proof of concept represents a very important step forward to ensuring that stored energy is not just available, but is strategically positioned to support system reliability when it matters most for the grid. We're now moving from a proof of concept stage towards developing additional technical capabilities and possible protocol changes to make the capability available for operational use. This tool is designed for only the most critical conditions when the grid is under real stress and every available resource matters. So this is going to be, again, a couple of the key focus areas. We've got a whole roadmap that Venkat talks about periodically during our technology and security committees, but these are a couple of the strategic focus areas that I wanted to highlight that are having an impact on the work that we're doing today. And then finally, I want to close with a recognition and thank the group of employees that have worked on this whole batch zero concept over the last 6+ months. This incredible group of people has worked in long days, nights, weekends, holidays to get this to where it is. There's 28 people across 10 departments that are noted on here. They've worked on the revision request. They've supported all the data requests from the industry, the escalations, and preparing to run the batch study, and making sure that the current process keeps running all along in the interim, and doing all of it under enormous scrutiny and enormous pressure to get this work done as quickly as possible. There have been over 80 stakeholder meetings, over 500 average participants for each of the workshops that we've had, 200+ hours of live discussions with stakeholders, 9 open meeting discussions on this topic, 200 survey responses collected, and every single one of them reviewed and analyzed carefully, 9 published comments related to that ERCOT has published related to Payroll 145 and NPR 1325. And I want to also recognize the critically important partnership with the PUCT that has enabled all of this to get done in the time period that it got done. It would not have been possible without clear leadership from Chair Gleason and the active engagement of each of the commissioners and the PUCT staff to make sure that we could get this done by today. So a big thanks to the employees and to everybody that was involved in doing this. So with that, I'll conclude my comments, Chair Flores, and if there's any questions, I'd welcome them.
Great report, Pablo, and I want to echo kudos to everyone from Team ERCOT, Team PUCT, and also TAG stakeholders that were part of the batch zero process. It was amazing work in an incredibly short period of time. Any questions for Pablo? Any comments? Okay, with that, we'll move on. Thank you, Pablo. We'll now welcome Pio Arenas to present Agenda Item 12, Update on the Texas Economy. Ms. Arenas is a labor economist at the Federal Reserve Bank of Texas, working on regional economic growth and demographic change. She manages the Regional and Microeconomics Group in the Dallas Fed Research Department. Pia, please proceed when ready, and welcome back. It's good to see you again.
Thank you, sir. Thanks for having me back. I appreciate being here, and wish you all good morning. Bring you this year the roller coaster theme because it's interesting times for many of us, for ERCOT certainly, for the Federal Reserve. So sometimes it can be hard to see where you're headed when you're upside down on the roller coaster. But with that, before I begin, let me issue our standard disclaimer. It's our views, of course, me and my co-author, Robert Lay, and so they don't reflect the views of the Federal Reserve System. So let's start with an overview. I want to point out, there's really some good news that Texas economic growth has really sped up this year. We're seeing that job and output growth have accelerated, and consumption, despite higher prices, consumption appears resilient. Certainly the data center construction and other, really what we're seeing more broadly is a kind of a manufacturing boom in the state and broadly in the nation as well. It's helping offset what we're seeing also in residential construction, which is a downturn. Housing markets are weak in Texas in particular, and of course higher fuel costs are putting pressure on spending in other sectors of retail markets. Our forecast is calling for continued growth, so that's good. Again, the outlook is a little bit clouded by the Iran war, and the other main concern that we have in the short run is stalled labor force growth, and I'll go more into that here in a minute. So on the kind of the tailwinds, there's a tremendous momentum in AI investment, as you know, and data center construction is ongoing, and there's massive investment, obviously, in this AI technology. We also have very expansionary fiscal policy nationally, and so that's helping boost growth. And here in Texas, the higher oil prices, while they make it harder for consumers, because we're such a massive producer and exporter of oil and gas, really higher oil prices, we expect, and the models predict, will add to growth on net. Lower tariffs this year compared to last year are also helping kind of boost our outlook for Texas. In terms of headwinds, as we look at our forecast, the headwinds are similar to what they were last year. But some of them are intensifying and some of them are less intense. So we're not dealing with kind of the high level of tariffs that we dealt with last year, but we are dealing with really low rates of in-migration into the state, and we'll look at that. Also, of course, geopolitical uncertainty in the Middle East. And then federal government cutbacks are weighing on the education and health sectors in our state and affecting the safety net for some Texan families. And then, of course, again, as I mentioned, higher inflation is reducing the purchasing power of consumers in our state. So let's get started with looking at job growth, really, and output growth. Those are kind of some of our main indicators. So this is annual job growth, and the last bar here in blue is Texas job growth year to date. And so really what you'll notice is that in 2025, we had very weak growth. We had 0.6% job growth in Texas, which was very low. The nation had even lower job growth, almost didn't create any jobs at all, 0.1%. And so that was very concerning. We're very happy this year to see really a bounce back. We're averaging 1.5% job growth so far this year at an annualized rate, and the U.S. is about 0.6%. So we're still not where we are typically, historically, but it's still a robust pace of growth. So we're happy to see that. The other interesting thing is that this is GDP growth also for Texas in blue and the U.S. in red, but the interesting thing here is that, we don't have 2026 data yet, but through 2025, you can see that we still had pretty good GDP growth in Texas and the nation, despite very low rates of job growth. So 2.3% GDP growth in Texas, 2% in the U.S. We average typically higher than that, but that's still a respectable rate of growth. And given that we didn't create many jobs last year, it really implies a very high rate of productivity. And of course, productivity is the secret sauce that makes us all better off when productivity growth is higher. So we were able to grow output without really growing jobs. The other thing that's interesting is that we didn't create a lot of jobs, but we also unemployment rate, however, was stable and continues to be stable this year. So I'm showing you two measures of unemployment here. One is the headline rate. That's the lower number. So for Texas and U.S., you can see we're at about 4.3% unemployment currently, and that's been relatively stable. It was pretty stable for most of last year. The other measure I'm showing you is a broader measure of unemployment that includes people that have stopped looking for jobs because they were discouraged, or people who are settling for a part-time job even though they would like a full-time job. So that broader measure is called the U6. And so we were concerned last year because that was moving up higher. And so we were watching that carefully. And then interestingly, this year so far, it's actually moved down. So we're not really seeing any broad slack in the labor market. In fact, the labor market, as far as unemployment, is looking pretty good. So there are other things, though, going on, which are some constraints on growth. And so, and I think I mentioned this when I came last year, and I try to always bring this in. The main reason that Texas is able to grow so much faster than the nation, we typically grow twice as fast as the nation in an average year. And that's really because of migration. And so it's migration from other states, and it's migration from other countries. And this is where we're seeing big declines. So this is net migration into Texas by year and divided into international and domestic. And so you can see kind of where we were in 2022, 2023, and 2024. We had tremendous net migration into the state. It was both domestic and international. I guess in 2024 it was predominantly international. So we had this incredible record in migration to the state, well over 400,000 net people in addition per year. And then in 2025, that really dropped down almost by 50%. And we're projecting that this year it'll fall, actually by more than 50%. So this is a challenge in the sense that certain industries, certainly in Texas, rely on not just productivity growth, but actual growth along the extensive margin, like more bodies. So there's that. And then how do you grow jobs at such a high pace, the pace at which we're accustomed to, without the workers? So this is something that we're watching, and this is something that could be constraining the outlook. Now, despite this, of course, like I mentioned, Texas has grown jobs at a pretty good clip so far this year. So where are we seeing this job growth by industry? And this is pretty interesting. So here I'm kind of looking at the main sectors so you can see exactly where we're growing the jobs. And I circled the two that I think are the biggest contributors. And so one is professional and business services, which didn't really grow last year at all, but is really expanding very quickly this year. 6.1% annualized growth so far this year in professional and business services, very unusual. So that's really mostly white-collar work, and those are really high-paid jobs. A lot of them are in Dallas and Austin. But when you look more closely at what's driving that number so far this year, it's a lot of temps, employment services. So if firms are hiring a record number of temps so far this year, we're really kind of trying to dig into that. It's very unusual. If you guys have any idea what's going on, certainly shoot me an email. But the good news about temp employment growth is usually it means that demand for workers is picking up, and so that in a few months we should see that play out in strength in labor demand and job growth more broadly. So that's certainly a positive sign about temps. But when you're hiring people temporarily and you're not hiring them permanently, also could mean that you are uncertain about the persistence of labor demand. So you want to not plunge right in and hire somebody permanently, but you're just doing it temporarily. So you can see, is this a pickup in demand that you're experiencing as a firm? Is that going to stick around? And lastly, it could reflect difficulty finding workers on your own. So if it's hard, you're spending a lot of time and resources searching for workers, you may just opt out and just turn to an employment agency and to kind of not spend so many resources on search. And that could be reflecting some of the labor shortages in the labor market. Some of that is related to the immigration situation we're experiencing. And the decline in domestic migration. It is certainly the labor force is, depending on which number you look at, is either not growing at all or worse. And so very little labor force growth. It'll be interesting to see how that's going to develop going forward and whether the temp momentum we're seeing in employment services is part of that. The other really interesting development is construction employment growth. And so we saw that last year. And we're seeing it even, bigger boost in construction employment this year. We've I can't remember a time we've seen such high growth in construction employment. And again, it's not residential. It's not apartments, and it's not single-family homes, because that construction activity has gone down, not up. So, I think you guys can guess, what I'm going to say on construction employment. But make you wait a little bit. Build the excitement here in the room. Okay, so what is happening in construction? Okay, so this is construction contract values. And so look at the total line is going up. That's the black line. And then the residential, again, that's apartments and single-family homes. So that's kind of went down significantly last year and has kind of been stable at a lower level. So, last year we were talking about a recession in residential construction activity. And so why is that happening? Well, basically because house prices are falling. Here I'm showing you house prices year over year changing in the U.S. in red, so those are slightly positive, and in Texas in blue, and then Dallas ones that are in the kind of teal line. So in Dallas, home prices are actually falling. In Texas as a whole, they're almost zero growth year on year. If you adjust for inflation, that's a negative number. So combined with falling prices, we also have high mortgage rates, and they just moved up again last week. So that's really making getting into a new home very unaffordable for Texas families. So that's really suppressing construction in the residential sector. So what is growing? Let's get back to it. So what's growing is here the green line and the blue line. So what's the green line? Green line is non-building. So if you look, that's construction activity, power plants, water infrastructure, those types of, roads and things. And that's really, and that green line is very volatile, and it really moved up, surged last year. And so we think it's related to the power infrastructure, certainly, and also the improvements we're doing to water infrastructure in the state and other infrastructure improvements. So that's a positive development. But it spikes, and then it'll come back down. The non-residential is the blue line, and that's really more what I'm going to talk about. That's really been trending up since 2021, 2022, and that's where the data centers are. So let's look more closely at that data center action. So that's the light blue line here. You see it's really been exponential growth in the construction activity around data centers. Really, overall last year it was about $11 billion, or about 5.7% of total construction activity was just data centers. But by the end of the year, given it was rising all last year, it was closer to 9% of total construction activity. So you think just data centers, that's a tremendous share of construction activity growth. That's just data centers. Texas rates pretty high on data center construction. We're number 2 in the nation. We're consistently number 2 after Virginia. And so you can understand why, if you want to build a data center and you have your pick of any state in the country, that it makes a lot of sense to come to Texas. Cheap land prices, relatively easy permitting, and relatively low electricity prices, thanks to ERCOT. So these are all reasons to come to Texas. And, frankly, I look at these data and I think it could even catapult us into the top state for data center construction. And I don't know if y'all think that's good news or bad news. Certainly more challenges for ERCOT. So one concern with data centers, of course, is what it's going to do to electricity prices. And so far pretty good. Let me show you some. This is retail electricity prices, so it's not just wholesale electricity. It actually includes transmission and distribution. So this is really how electricity prices, inflation adjusted, have evolved since 2015. California, that's not a data center thing, I don't think. It's mostly transmission and distribution. They have had a lot of fires that have destroyed a lot of their infrastructure around electricity transmission, and so they've had to rebuild that. They've faced a lot of costs, fixed costs in their electricity prices. So that's really been driving their prices up quite a bit over this period of time. Texas is the bottom line. It's the blue line again. And there, if you adjust for inflation, you can see retail electricity prices are actually down from 2015. So we're really not seeing the data center construction, which has been massive, play out in electricity prices here yet. But you can see in Virginia a little bit, it looks like definitely in Virginia started last year in particular, that orange line to move up. We think that's the number 1 state for data center construction. We're thinking that's spilling over into electricity prices, and that would make sense. We actually have some really interesting research at the Dallas Fed, and I wanted to share the conclusions of that research by my colleagues Owen Kay and Reed Taylor and their co-author. And they're actually measuring a lot of these things exactly with great data that they were able to get on data center constructions and openings and electricity prices, and they certainly make a lot of assumptions about load growth and so forth. But they look at the impact of data centers on wholesale electricity prices, and here's what they find. So looking backward, they find that new data centers or data centers in total have added about 3% to wholesale electricity prices in our region, in the ERCOT region, in the period 2021 to 2025. So 3% is not much. And that's significantly less than the national average. So like I said on the prior slide, doesn't seem like we're seeing a lot of pressure on prices here yet. Forward-looking, however, continued data center construction and openings are expected to add about 10% to wholesale electricity prices in the ERCOT region in 2026 to 2028. So that's still below the national average. Could be worse. So that's kind of what we're dealing with, and certainly. The working paper is available online at the Dallas Fed website, so I encourage you to go and look at the assumptions that they make to get these results, and then, or even better, invite them and speak to the board so you can hear firsthand from their research. But I really took away good news times 2, which is kind of my last bullet on the slide, which is from reading their paper, from what I understand, it means that ERCOT region price increases really are lower than the national average despite all the data center construction, and we are still projected to have the lowest wholesale prices for electricity in the nation, at least over the next 2 years or so, although not nearly by as much as before. So there's that. So I hope you enjoyed that research. Let's turn to traditional energy, so oil and gas markets, let's say, and talk a little bit about developments there. So we mentioned the geopolitical uncertainty. We mentioned the Iran war in particular. And as you know, it's done a lot to oil prices. And here I'm trying to show you just how quickly oil prices moved sharply higher with the Iran war, which started in March. So here, when I turned in my slides, WTI was above 100. I think today it's closer to $92 a barrel. And that's, of course, far above the break-even price for drilling a new well in the Permian, which is closer to maybe $55. And so you'd think with these high prices, surely Texas oil companies or national oil companies that operate in the Permian will surely go out there and drill more. Well, of course, the uncertainty here is how long these prices will last. And so most people don't think they will last that long. Not long enough to motivate more drilling, which really, to drill a new well and bring it online for production can take 6 to 12 months. So really to warrant more drilling on the base of this price surge, it would really have to be more long-term than we expect it to be. I think analysts keep expecting the Iran war to be resolved. Last I heard, it's, by the end of the summer, but of course this keeps getting moved out, as it continues. We see in that blue line a little uptick in Texas rig count, but certainly nothing to write home about, again, for the reasons that I'm mentioning. There are other headwinds that Texas oil producers face, and that's certainly some of the usual concerns, but one major one, and I'll get to that in a minute, is certainly the fact that when you take the oil out, you also you get a lot of associated natural gas, and there's nowhere to put it. Gas pipelines out of the Permian are full, and so there's no takeaway capacity. So it's actually a cost for the oil producer to try to move out his gas as if he tries to increase production of oil. We have some, if you're interested, really the closure of the Strait of Hormuz has shut in a lot of oil production. That's kind of why the oil prices have moved up. Right now, we think about, I think the global production of oil, or the shut-in oil production, is about 13% of the global total, so between 10 and 15 million barrels per day. Here's some estimates I'm sharing with you on the left for different countries in terms of, the shut-in is bad because when you shut the well in, you have to stop it from producing, and then, of course, in order to start it back up again, you got to go in and build up the pressure in the well and get the oil to come out. So that takes time too. So on the right, I'm kind of sharing what analysts think is how long it'll take to bring that shut-in production back in the Middle East. And so we think, 4 to 6 months is really kind of what the expectation is. So once the hostilities cease, the Strait of Hormuz is open, we're still expecting, it'll take 4 to 6 months to get that oil production back up. In the meantime, here in the U.S., we're the number one producer of oil in the world. We're producing, 13.5 to 14 million barrels per day. We're exporting as much as we can, but we're at capacity. We're really at capacity. And so there's really nothing we can do to address this oil shortage more than what we're currently doing. So as a result, when we asked in the Dallas Fed Energy Survey, really only our energy producers here in Texas and New Mexico only expect a small increase in U.S. oil production this year as a result of the Iran war. So they're saying about 250,000 barrels per day in addition to the 5.8 that we're producing now in Texas, and 5.8 million. And so that's a very small increase. Might be a little bit more, and then they think it'll be a little bit more this year, a little bit more next year, but we're not really expecting big increases in oil production as a result of what's going on now. And then, of course, I mentioned earlier, one constraint on these oil producers is that this natural gas that comes out with the oil is costly to get rid of because there's no pipeline capacity. So this Waha price of gas is negative, which means that oil producers have to pay companies to take that gas away when they produce oil. And so that's also a constraint on them. Also an incentive to go and produce and build more power plants in the Permian and take advantage of negative gas prices, right, to produce cheap electricity. So that's kind of the upside of this. And I think some of that's happening in the oil fields. There's certainly more power plant construction in West Texas. Okay, so moving right along, I wanted to talk a little bit about trade. As I mentioned to you, two really important developments last year, the big increase in tariffs, and then the fact that Texas is the number one trading state in the nation. So we're a much smaller economy than, for example, California, but we have many, many more exports than California. And so we are a very important exporter and importer in the nation. And this is what happened to tariff rates, the realized tariff rates, not like the headline tariff rates you might see in the newspaper, but still a really significant increase last year. So this is the tax on imports, and it went from about an average of about 2% to over 10% last year. And then, of course, interestingly, with the IEEPA ruling here in February, when some of those tariffs were ruled, unconstitutional, they went away, and so you can see that the tariff rate has dropped significantly since its peak. But in the meantime, if you tax something, you have less of it. So we did see a decline in imports last year of about 5.5%, and that's kind of the first bar here. The second bar I'm trying to show you, this is actually work by my colleague, Kei Mu-Yi, and so this is for the U.S. He's showing you a decline in imports of 5.5% last year. In Canada, a decline of 13.5%. China, a decline of 42%. Mexico, imports actually went up slightly from Mexico. And that's mostly because in the last bar, we're buying a lot of computer and electronic products from Mexico. They make stuff that goes into the data centers. We're back to data centers. Can't get away from it. So the AI boom is fueling a lot of imports, especially in these computer and electronic equipment. So and you can see it here again. So in terms of the outlook, this is kind of what we're concerned with going forward. So this is inflation. This is CPI inflation, which is the only measure we have for Texas. I'm showing you Texas in blue and U.S. CPI inflation in red. And I'm showing you both the headline measure in the solid line and the core measure, which strips out food and energy. That's the dashed line. And so you can just see how sharply these increased with the start of the war in Iran. So much of this is oil prices, of course, so that really for the consumer, it's gasoline prices. So that increases the cost of transportation services, which many firms are obviously using transportation services. So it can trickle through the economy. And so we're seeing sharp increases. Still interesting that Texas has much lower inflation, still even now, than the U.S. And so some of that's related to the fact that our house prices and rents have been falling. So, that's mixed news. So here you can kind of see that obviously this higher inflation is going to make it harder for the Fed to lower, interest rates because obviously the inflation target for the Fed is 2%. And so currently the U.S. inflation rates, whether you look at this measure or other measures, we're really far from 2%. What are Texas businesses saying about their outlook? They're still in positive territory on their outlooks, but they're less optimistic than they were. And I think some of this downshifting in these lines that I'm showing you, which is future investment, future capital expenditure, future company outlook, and future business activity, those are all things that we ask in our business outlook surveys. For our Texas companies, they've all come down significantly. They came down with the start of the Iran war. You can also see really how bullish companies were coming into this year. We really had a very robust outlook. And so we still have a positive outlook for this year, both in Texas and the U.S., but it's not as positive as it was. So let me conclude, and I'm happy to take your questions. So the Texas economy is growing faster this year after what was really a weak 2025, especially as it concerns job growth. The labor market continues to look resilient with higher job growth and low unemployment. Our forecast for this year is currently running pretty high. It's running at 1.8% job growth. And we keep worrying that we're not going to get there because we keep looking at the labor force growth. And as I told you, it's either zero or negative, depending on which measure you're looking at. And that is, again, related to the migration to the state and the immigration into the state. So that's kind of our concern. The AI boom continues to boost, really, construction activity and manufacturing in our state and the nation. So the outlook for the rest of the year is, again, continued growth. The risks, we mentioned labor force growth. We mentioned consumers. They're negatively affected by the higher inflation. Right now, it looks like consumption still is pretty solid, but they may be dipping into the credit cards to kind of sustain some of that spending. And so, we really have to watch that. Because if the purchasing power is reduced by higher prices, how will households contend, with the needs that they have in terms of paying for housing and food and so forth. At the same time, we're watching pressure on the safety net in Texas and really, I guess, across the nation. But there's been cuts to higher education, certainly, and to certain health programs and food stamp programs, for example, that are adversely affecting some households, and so we're watching that. And then the other thing that we're watching is kind of more of a long-term concern. So our free trade agreement with Mexico is a big reason that Texas, is the number one exporter in the nation, and so that's the USMCA agreement. It used to be the NAFTA agreement. Now it has a different name, but it's still a really important tool with which we use to trade with Mexico and Canada. And so it's up for review here in July. And so we're hoping, for a good outcome, that they keep the agreement in place with maybe some minor revisions. But it's important for Texas, for our economy. And that's all I had. And so thank you so much. I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Pia. I particularly like the title of the slide on slide 3, a twist and turns overview. That was great. Any questions for Pia? Okay, Julie.
Pia, thank you for the presentation, the research, and your interpretation of the research. My question's about the Texas economy growth. You mentioned labor is the number one constraint down there right now. If there was sufficient labor, what would be next in terms of a constraint, and is lack of infrastructure on that short list? Specifically roads, water, electricity.
Yeah. So that's a good question. I'm not sure I have an answer. So generally, the way we see Texas has been really pro-growth, and that includes infrastructure. So whether it's roads, okay, we may be building toll roads. I know people don't like toll roads, but it means there's a road there. So we've been really aggressive in building infrastructure, building homes, and we're aggressive about expanding our and ensuring the reliability of our obviously our grid. And so I think generally, although I'm sure there's measures of infrastructure that would show maybe the quality of infrastructure is not what it should be. But generally, we think that the state has been good in keeping up with growth. And certainly look at the ports and what we're building in terms of export infrastructure, LNG exports, which has been just booming. So I have to say we've been good on growth, and I hate to think that I'm missing something. That's kind of my talking point on infrastructure for Texas is we're a really pro-growth state and so that's an area where compared to other states we tend to do well. Oh, water. Okay, I knew I was forgetting something. Okay, so water, that may be something where we could do more because, and that's really tricky on water infrastructure because it gets very, that's because if you need more water over here, you're taking it from someone else over here, and that can get really contentious and very political and divisive. So I think that's one area on water where we could really do better, but it's hard. It's hard. When you look at the water supply and water demand, the biggest users of water in the state are actually farmers and ranchers. So they use over 50% of Texas water. But so there's we have water, but you're going to, good luck taking that from the people that are using it and giving it to someone else and saying that, they should have it. So we're worried, for in Corpus Christi, we have definitely very severe water shortages, a lot of industry. That's an area where they went through a big boom. Lots of industry moved in. They had water requirements. They were promised a lot of water, and then we didn't follow up on the supply side. So that's definitely, I'm glad I remembered that. Thanks for the question, Jill.
Chair Gleason.
Thank you for this presentation. I think this is really instructive as we think about data center development in the state. So on slide 19, you talk about your projection that between 2026 and 2028, a 10% increase in wholesale prices based on data center development. You also showed on a previous slide the divergence between state GDP and national GDP of about 15% in 2025. Do you assume that accompanying those electric price increases from 26 to 28 will be a further divergence in state GDP and national GDP because of data center development in this state? Meaning, we're going to see electricity prices grow up, but are we also going to see an accompanying increase in state GDP because of all of that development over those years?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's billions, tens of billions of investment in our state. So that's definitely going to increase, the value of output. It has relatively small effects on employment. So I think the Brookings Institute published a paper on the employment effects of data centers, and I think that's only one to two jobs per $1 million of investment. So it's not like building a Walmart, which would create, hundreds of jobs. But it has very small employment effects, but of course it has bigger GDP effects. It has, it's going to increase, obviously, electricity prices, but it also increases the build-out, as ERCOT is experiencing, right, and PUC, the build-out of the infrastructure so, it increased demand for electricity, increased supply of electricity. I think, some of the criticisms are valid for the data center, but at the same time, it's contributing to growth, absolutely.
So that's an interesting point. When you talk about employment, so 1 to 2 jobs per $1 million of spend. Is that permanent jobs or temporary jobs or all jobs?
I think it's permanent jobs, yeah. So this is not our paper. This is actually this Brookings paper that just was published, and I think that's what they concluded. That is permanent jobs. Some of them, I think, are in the information sector, so it does create some high-skilled, highly paid jobs, especially around, high tech. So it's not just construction jobs. It does create some permanent jobs in the information sector.
Yeah, and I guess the only thing I would say to that is, the definition of a permanent job. A lot of these campuses are going to be built out for 5, 10 years and make long-term construction jobs, many of which are really high-paying, actually. And so I think, like most things, how you define that term is really important, because I think over the long run for the next decade, this really will, end up creating a lot of what I would consider permanent construction jobs.
Yeah, I didn't see the breakout for construction, but certainly as long as they're being built, they're creating construction jobs. But after they're no longer being built, then the construction employment effect should taper off.
Yeah, I think most workers would consider, a 10-year, build out and having that job pretty permanent. So
permanent versus temporary. Yeah, we think of being in months versus years. I agree.
Any other questions for Pia? I have a couple. I just wanted you. A couple of questions. On slide 18, you show the inflation-adjusted change in prices for electricity. It just looks to me like even after a 10% increase, were that to actually happen, Texas is still below where it would be in 2015 on an inflation-adjusted basis. Is that a fair assumption?
These are, so the 10% is wholesale, and this is retail.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so I don't know what's going to happen to retail because, well, sir, as you know better than I do, is that, well, by the time you get from the wholesale to the retail, you got to add in all the transmission, distribution, all the fixed costs. So, so I can't say for sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the second thing, back to the Brookings data center study for a minute. Do you know if I haven't seen it, do you know if they analyzed the follow-on virtuous cycle impact of the increases in local property tax bases that get invested in education and local infrastructure and things like that?
Yeah, that is another benefit, is certainly the tax revenue, the additional tax revenue. So that's another benefit, but I don't remember if they looked specifically at that. But yeah, I'm glad you mentioned it because I didn't mention it. But that's another benefit.
Okay, I don't see anybody else that wants to ask any questions. Pia, thanks for coming back, and we'll look forward to bringing you back this time next year.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
All right, we're going to move on to more exciting stuff. And now that we've talked about economics, agenda item 13 is the consent agenda. It includes agenda item 13.1, unopposed revision request, which have been recommended by TAC for approval. We've made a decision to exclude two of the unanimously approved items from TAC because we believe they warrant further discussion, and that has to do with Paragraph 145 and NPR 1325. So we'll have those discussions when we get into agenda item 15.1. So we're going to take up the batch zero. So Chad, can you walk us through the budget impacts of the unopposed revision request except for 1325 and 145?
Yes, Chair. There are 16 revision requests on the consent agenda. None of them have an ERCOT full-time equivalent impact. Two of them, NPR 1315 and PIGR 143, have an ERCOT budget impact of less than $10,000, and those revision requests can be absorbed by our operations and maintenance budget. I would call out NPR 1264, which is the creation of the new Energy Attribute Certification Program, which has an ERCOT budget impact between $150,000 and $250,000, and a project duration of 4 to 6 months to implement phase 2. So the board may recall that this topic was discussed back in June of 2025, and we moved forward through the stakeholder process. This will allow us to move forward with a third-party administrator to administer this program. ERCOT will go out for an RFP after the PUC approves it in their July timeframe, and then ultimately we'll present qualified administrators through a series of workshops and ultimately get TAC recommendation that'll end up coming to the board for board approval as far as the third-party administrator. I think with the timeline that we're on, the earliest you would see that would be at the December board meeting where you're making a decision on the third-party administrator under this NPR 1264. And as you indicated, Figure 145 has a separate impact analysis that we can talk about once we get to that item. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thanks, Chad. Any questions on the unopposed revision request? Okay. If not, I'll entertain a motion to approve those items.
So moved.
Okay, thank you. Chris, thanks. Bill for the second. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, the unopposed revision requests have been approved. Again, we'll talk about Figure 145 and NPR 1325 in a few minutes. Next is Agenda Item 14, the 2026 Summer Outlook, which includes two sub-items. The first is Agenda Item 14.1, the 2026 Summer Weather and Operations Outlook, presented by Dan Woodfin. Dan.
Good morning. I've got 4 topics to share with you: weather, load, new tools, and transmission. That are all things that we are looking at for this summer. First, weather. With the upcoming kind of the strengthening kind of really significant El Nino, the weather profile that we're likely to see over the next few months is a little more even uncertain than usual. Our meteorologists believe we're probably looking at close to normal temperatures and rainfall during this period, normal being over the last 15 years. So it won't be extreme like 2023, although there is some potential for that. But if you look at the last 15 years, those years are significantly hotter. So the normal for the last 15 years is significantly hotter than, say, the last 130 years. So this would be a hot year if you looked over the since 1895 period. The meteorologists are saying it could be as hot as 2023, but that will depend how long this kind of rainy period that we're seeing now, and looks like it's going to be again this week, how long that lasts. If it'll last, more into June, then we're less likely to see. The longer it lasts, the less likely we'll see a hot period. And the good news is that with this strengthening El Nino, I'm sure most of you have seen this on the news, that this likelihood is that we'll have fewer hurricanes in the Atlantic Basin this year, although, as we all recognize, it only takes one, and sometimes those things spin up down in the Gulf rather than coming across the Atlantic. So there's still some potential, and we've got to be prepared for that. We've done our usual training for hurricane preparedness. So in terms of load, we've talked a lot about load forecast, kind of looking at long term, but looking at kind of what are we expecting for this summer. We've had, last year was a fairly mild year. We've had several years in a row where we've been in the 84, 85 gigawatt range, depending on what the temperatures are. We've seen some crypto growth. We've also seen large load growth that we've been talking a lot. Some of that's already starting to play out. And so we're looking at this summer being without demand response at a little over 92 gigawatts. Now, we would expect to see a little over 4,000 megawatts of demand response we typically have with the cryptos turning off and other things. And so we'd get down to metered demand of around 88. But that would still be a new all-time peak demand for the summer. From a transmission perspective, we're showing this a little different than we usually do. I usually point out specific hotspots. We're showing it more graphically this year. Every year we do a study of kind of where do we need constraint management plans. Where do we see problems that doesn't appear that we could resolve with redispatch, given the load growth, given the amount of transmission on the system. And so we look at that every summer. We develop plans for how are we going to deal with these. So this graphically uses those congestion management plans that we've had to develop and the number of them to indicate where we're likely to see problems this summer in terms of transmission, and how you'll see that in the gray bars, those are the numbers of plans by area that we had last year. They're a little higher in most places this year As you can see, Far West has by far the most of these, which is what you'd expect because we're seeing a lot of load growth in that area, and there's lots of transmission coming, but it's not all there yet. And then some in West and also some in North Central, South Central. So that kind of gives you a graphic overview of where we might see transmission issues this summer. From an operational perspective, we've got a couple of different kinds of new tools that we've developed, and we'd like to share this every year. As what are kind of some of the new tools that we're going to be using? One is something that you approved at the last meeting, which is most of our ancillary services get released by RTC plus B based on price curves. So that's how SCED will kind of automatically release those. But our offline non-spin, the operators still have to make a decision to deploy that. We've had a series of tools in place for how to do that. As the system continues to evolve, we've evolved that, what those tools look like. And so this OBDRR that you passed last time and the PUC is now approved, we'll be using that this summer. It allows us to take into account state of charge of the batteries when determining when to release that non-spin. And the second thing is something that we talked also about yesterday, the Large Load Curtailment Manager, which is this tool that will ultimately allow us to implement the curtailment of the large load in an organized way. We talked about this in the TNS section yesterday, but specifically what will be in place for this summer is the ability to use it to forecast and then deploy the net metered that Pablo talked about earlier, the net metered sites where you've got a new data center that's co-located with an existing prior to September of last year generator. And those are being approved by the commission, so we need to have that in place for this summer. And so it should be there soon. And then specifically, one other transmission thing I want to talk about, because we've talked about this last time, the Far West issue where we've got a lot of load growth. We've started to see some transmission limitations there. What we're considering this based on the forecast of where the load growth was expected to be based on surveys that we'd done previously from the transmission owners in the area. What we're seeing is it may not be that load growth may not be tracking as significantly growing as fast as what we were originally thinking last time we talked about this. You can see that we're still through the period we've basically been under that kind of no outage type limit shown in the current line here, but there's still a significant amount of growth that could happen once those places start to put the load in place. And so what we're doing is updating. We're going to be updating the numbers. We've issued this RFI out to the transmission providers to get updated information that's to see, okay, are we expecting this to continue to not grow as fast, or is it coming and it's just not there yet? It's probably the latter, but we need a better view of when that's expected. And so they're supposed to have this data back to us by the end of this month. We'll be able to share that with you at the next meeting. Just wanted to give you an update on that.
Dan, just quick on the graph.
Uh-huh.
There's a very large lift in the crypto number. Can you give us a little color on that?
Yeah, so the crypto, this was based off of kind of last year's long-term load forecast numbers, or the numbers that were in there, and it was expected that was going to have ramped up more by now, and so that's, it could be, there's a little bit of Heisenberg probably going on here where we've talked a lot about this area, and it may be that that people respond to the fact that the expectation is that there's going to be more higher prices and more constraint into that area. And so that load may be slowing down until some of the transmission gets there.
Dan? Hey, so on the congestion management plan, I mean, it's a substantive increase, right? So kind of put that in perspective from where we were, the amount of local load shed that we could be thinking about, and then just as we go forward, a lot of these transmission projects are not going to be completed for an extended period of time and what that means as we go forward in the future.
Yeah, so basically go back to that one. The congestion management plans, we develop these kind of a lot of times on the fly. These are ones that are developed kind of looking more seasonal studies, and they assume certain amount of load growth and so forth. But we don't actually need to implement them unless that load growth actually occurs and we actually see the overloads in our contingency analysis. So this is more of a being prepared,
Right.
just in case, based on those projections. As far as perspective goes, most of them are localized, and so I wouldn't expect, and almost by definition, these are not things that we do pre-contingency. It's only if a transmission line actually trips, which is a pretty low likelihood, that we would actually have to implement most of them.
But you see that just given where we're at, I mean, it depends on load growth. Those likely,
Yes.
That planning to continue fairly aggressively until we can alleviate some of those constraints.
I think that's probably right. As you see things locally growing more, that we may need more kind of these plans just to make sure we've got an insurance policy.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay.
Any other questions for Dan? All right. Thanks, Dan. Next is agenda item 14.2, the 2026 Summer Markets Outlook, that's going to be presented by Keith Collins. Keith?
Well, there it is.
That's Dan's. Now we're going to go forward, yeah. Yep, that's it. All right, perfect. All right, good morning. I'm here to present the Summer Markets Outlook. And I think what's interesting here is ultimately what we're going to see in a second here is that forward prices are trending lower, but once you factor in the gas prices, it's generally pretty flat. Okay, so starting with the forward power prices for summer 2026, what we do is we compare that over the last few years, and ultimately the line you see in the middle is 2026, looking out for essentially through the summer months. And what we see here is again, it looks like it's trending a bit down relative to the other prices. And while that is true, what we have to do is think about what's also going on in the gas market at the same time. And so what we have here is a historic view of what gas prices have been doing on a daily level over the last several years. And what we see here is that the trend in 2026 is generally been a bit down relative to 2025 in particular, and a bit more comparable than we saw in, I believe, closer to 2023. And so when we go ahead and look at the forward gas prices, and that's what we see reflected here on the left, is that the blue bars are a little bit down relative to what we saw over last year. And when we factor in the decline in the power prices and the decline in the gas prices, the heat rates, which are shown in the right-hand chart, are generally about the same as what we saw in 2025. So even though power prices are lower, gas prices are lower, the heat rates are such that they're generally factoring in about the same, which really means that prices this year are very similar to last year on a heat rate on an adjusted gas price basis. And so I think there's potentially a few different reasons for that. Obviously, expectations, as Dan sort of said, normal over the last 15 years, but hot. I think that's generally not unlike what we saw last year as well. So some of those expectations on weather definitely factoring into what we're seeing here. When we look at forward price trends or long-term forward price trends, I think the caution here is that generally this is not as liquid, but it is the best price that we do have. And what we have here is a view of what these prices are for 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, and what that snapshot in time, a year ago, 6 months ago, et cetera. And generally, what we see there are lower power prices. Again, that can be a function of the gas price as well, and what that is. But I think it's just pretty critical to note that when we talk about increasing loads and increasing demand on the system, what we're not seeing is we haven't seen that reflected any forward pricing at this time in terms of what these forward price trends are showing. And so again, there could be expectations on what those loads will be coming out of the batch process. Could be something that could help provide more clarity and certainty. But right now we're in a period of uncertainty, and I think these prices are effectively reflecting that. And then the final chart is just is sort of a seasonal view of the chart we just showed you. The other one is an annual view. Obviously, there's a seasonal view going forward. But I'll pause here and see if there are any questions on the summer forward price outlook.
Any questions? Okay. Thanks, Keith.
All right, thank you.
All right, now time for more fun stuff. I'd like to invite Caitlin Smith, Chair of the Technical Advisory Committee, to present Agenda Item 15, the TAC report. Caitlin, please proceed with your TAC report to Agenda Item 15.1.1, which is NPR 1308. It's a board priority related to NOGR 282 large computation load ride-through requirements, and also Agenda Item 15.1.1.2, NOGR 282 large computational load ride-through requirements. And we'll get on with the other ones after that.
Okay. I have a very long report, so get the hook out. I'm Caitlin Smith. I'm chair of the Technical Advisory Committee. In our April and May months, we had three full days of TAC meetings. We had a fourth scheduled, but we didn't need it, so Chad got off the hook for dinner. But we recommended approval of 23 revision requests and endorsed 6 regional planning group projects. Those are quite high numbers for both. Here's the list of the 18 revision requests that were unopposed. I was going to highlight NPR 1264, but Chad did that. As you guys know, you heard about that at the board. It was a long stakeholder process. And then, as we've noted, 1325 and PIGR 145, the batch zero process, are on the unopposed list. So if anyone wants to cheer or dance, you can do that. Here's the list of revision requests that do have opposing votes. And then on our highlights, here are the 6 RPG items. I'm not going to cover these. Christy covered them yesterday, and you have already voted on them. But we endorsed 6 projects. Over 2 meetings, we had 1 abstention on one of the projects. TAC priority items. So today, I think, is a milestone. We have addressed many of these, and we're asking for board approval following the recommendation of TAC today. Contracts for capacity, batch zero study process, dispatchable reliability reserve service, large electronic load ride-through requirements. I think that's large computational loads now. And then firm fuel supply service. We do have more in process. I think most of these are due by the end of the year. Energy storage, resource inclusion, and DRRS. As you know, after stakeholder and then commission discussion, the direction was to have ESR participation in DRRS in a separate MPRR, but to hopefully implement that at the same time as the start of implementation of DRRS. That MPRR was filed on Friday. Batch study continued. My understanding is that we will aim to have those revision requests to the February board. So this is, how we're transitioning from our current process then to batch 0, which is a transitional batch, and then to the ongoing batch study on the 12-month cadence. We have a longer time frame to do this, but we also know more, and I think we'll continue to know more, learn more about how the batch 0 feeds into the transmission plan. We had a lot of asks during batch 0 that we did not get to. I think we will continue to hear those asks. So I think it'll be, longer time frame, but I think people will expect more. So a lot of policy discussions and decisions still to be made. ERS enhancement, this MPR was filed last week as well. This is sort of taking the spirit of something in SB 6, which is cutting down on load participation and demand response if that load is already curtailing in response to price, because they're sort of self-deploying as if they were already in that service. I don't know if Keith is going to speak more to it, but it establishes a baseline that you have to qualify for. So a load with a dynamic shape won't qualify, or has to select a baseline to participate. And I believe that we want by the end of the year. Yep. Generation firming, this MPR was filed in April, so a little bit longer ago. Implements some new generation firming programs that was originally in HB 1500, was implemented into PUC rule, so now we need to implement it into protocol. The law applies to resources with a signed interconnect agreement after January 1 of 2027. After those resources have a year of experience after commissioning. So practically that's, maybe 2.5 years after that Jan 1, 2027 date. But because of those resources, it applying to those resources at that time, we need to pass this by the end of the year. Firm fuel supply service, NPR 1335 also filed last week. So we had a very busy market rules team, I think, to implement the protocols that the PUC recently adopted for phase 3 of the firm fuel supply service. And then a big item on here is the 2027 ancillary service methodology. We do this every year to determine ancillary service procurement for the following year. A couple of years ago, we added commission approval. So in order to get all the approvals by the end of the year, we have to start this now so it can be approved by this board in September and receive commission approval by the end of the year. We implemented the probabilistic model for this year. You may remember that last year we had some very spirited discussions around this, especially around non-spin and ECRS procurement. I told Chairman Gleason I would bring this up. He brought up the conservative operations and when do we need to think about revisiting that. And that's already been a topic of discussion among stakeholders. I will say, we were happy to hear from ERCOT and the IMM that they are collaborating on this. And so hopefully those discussions will go smoothly this year. Any questions before I get to the... All right. First priority revision request with opposing votes. NOGR 282, large computational load ride-through requirements, establishes frequency and voltage ride-through requirements for these loads. On April 29th, TAC voted to recommend approval of NOGR 282 as recommended by Ross before us. We did have 2 opposing votes. Both of those were industrial consumers, and we had 4 abstentions. Those were the small commercial consumer, cooperative segment, independent generator segment, and IREP segment. We did not receive the opposing vote explanation, but we did see comments filed by TIEC, who represent the industrial consumers, on May 21st. Those comments focus on ERCOT's legal authority to impose requirements on end-use consumers, who we typically think of being the ones that we set the grid up to reliably serve. We heard, I think I've spoken about this at the board before. We had a discussion between those 2 parties, TIC and ERCOT, at a previous TAC leading up to the vote. It's really a debate on the interpretation of the law, right? In PURA, consumers are not listed in an explicit list of entities subject to ERCOT protocols, but however, in PURA, as we all know, ERCOT is required to ensure the reliability and adequacy of the electrical network. TIAC had an alternate proposal, which would be to have the TSPs continue to have requirements, but I think there's some question and ability for the TSPs to see the frequency and voltage issues in real time. We had a couple of other discussion points. The most notable was about the applicability date. This is an issue we've talked about for a while, and the NOGR was the second iteration of a revision request on this topic. So when the NOGR was filed, the applicability date was basically the filing date. So we did receive some comments concerned about the policy of having a applicability date set before the actual effective date. And NPR 1309 goes along with that NOGR, and it's the definition.
I think we need to stop your report here, and then finish the discussion of 1308, 282. So stand by close, and then we'll have a vote on that. So at this point in time, I'd like to, does the board have any questions on Caitlin's report to this point, particularly on 1308 and 282? Okay. With that, I'm going to invite Jeff Bellow and Nathan Bigby to present agenda item 15.1.1.3. ERCOT comments on NOGR 282 and NPR 1308. It's my understanding that the staff recommends approval of NOGR 282 as modified by the ERCOT written comments dated May the 11th, and that were included in the meeting materials. Jeff and Nathan, please highlight what was recommended in the May 11th comments while you're going through your presentation.
Yeah, okay, will do. Yeah, so when I talk to people outside of Texas, I get asked more about the voltage ride-through issues, more so than batch, and that's because this is an extremely important topic for industry. And the reason it is important is because, as we've already seen on our system, we've had a number of events where the large computational loads will trip for what we would consider normal events on the system, a normal fault on the system. These loads are tripping off, and that creates a reliability issue. And as we think about the continued growth of these types of facilities on the system, if we do not address this now, then this is going to grow into an issue that could become either voltage or frequency stability issue. And so from a reliability perspective, this is really a critical piece. I think Dan covered yesterday some studies around. We've looked at other alternatives such as transmission improvements or maybe some market type products that could enhance this. But at the end of the day, the ultimate solution is at the facilities, is to require the facilities to be able to meet these certain ride-through requirements. And so that's the reliability need for this. I did also want to highlight, as Chair Flores mentioned, that we filed comments because we realized that a previous version of comments had inadvertently omitted a couple of dates. So we added those dates back in on our, I believe it was the May 11th comments. So this is after the TAC vote. Just wanted to add those back in, but did not substantively change from what the intent was initially. So with that, I'll let Nathan speak on the legal side.
Good morning. Thank you, Jeff. I'm just here to briefly cover the legal justification for NOGR 282 and NPR 1308. I think Caitlin Smith did a great job summarizing the gist of that debate at TAC, but I did want to go down in a slightly deeper level of detail to talk about ERCOT's position. Obviously, the Texas Industrial Energy Consumers and the Texas Blockchain Council both submitted comments regarding ERCOT's jurisdiction or its authority to regulate pure retail customers, as they phrased it. And that's an important question, important consideration. We have taken a hard look at that, and our conclusion is that ERCOT should be understood to have the authority to impose regulations on pure retail customers when that is necessary to ensure system reliability. And we believe that is the justification, as Jeff pointed out. There have been a number of events where you've seen these large loads tripping off. That's attracted attention, not just at ERCOT, but at the NERC level as well. There's national interest in trying to find a way to solve this problem. And ERCOT, as a leader here, is taking the lead in developing a standard for ride-through for the ERCOT region. The primary justification that we would point to for our authority to impose reliability-based standards would be Section 39.151 of PURA, which requires ERCOT as the PUC-designated independent organization for the ERCOT region to ensure the reliability and adequacy of the regional electrical network. We don't talk about this provision every day at ERCOT, but it is really the gist of what we do, the primary motivation for our role here under state law. And that really provides the justification for the majority of reliability-related requirements, revision requests, NPRRs, NOGRs, PIGRs that bear on the reliability of the system. So that's a very large number of revision requests that you will see coming through the pipeline here at ERCOT. So things like generator ride-through, things like interconnection standards, all of those things relate to reliability and ultimately find their legal foundation in this grant of authority under PURA. And that's not just an authorization, it's really a mandate to ensure the reliability of the system. So when we see a threat to reliability, it is incumbent on ERCOT and the PUC collectively ultimately to act to ensure the reliability of the system. Of course, ERCOT has delegated authority under the PUC's Rules 25361B to ensure the reliability of the system consistent with the statutory grant of authority. So the primary argument that TIEC and to some extent the Texas Blockchain Council had previously made is that there are two competing provisions in PURA that could be construed to suggest a constraint on ERCOT's authority. And one of those is 39151J, which spells out a number of types of participants that are required to follow rules. And our interpretation of that is simply that the legislature was indicating that those entities that are subject to the PURA framework must follow ERCOT rules. That is an essential part of the regulatory framework. That's the logic for that requirement as we see it. It was not intended to implicitly foreclose any ability of the Commission or ERCOT to regulate entities that may not fall within that litany. Those were the cast of characters the Commission had identified in SB 7 back in 1999, and the legislature wanted to make sure that those entities are subject to the requirements that ERCOT and the PUC establish, really ERCOT in this provision that ERCOT establishes. And so that, from our perspective, is the purpose of that provision, not to implicitly foreclose ERCOT regulations that may impact other entities. ERCOT already has rules that have to reach outside the formal market participant registration framework. For example, our planning guide requires any entity that is proposing to interconnect a generator to the system to follow the interconnection process. We have an entity called an interconnecting entity under the planning guide that describes the entity that is seeking to interconnect a generator to the system. So that entity is subject to that regulatory framework, even though they are not a registered market participant necessarily. So that's a good example. Another example of a type of participant that is not in the enumerated list in PURA is a qualified scheduling entity. QSEs are an essential part of our framework. They are the entities we communicate with on behalf of generators, and we also settle with for purposes of sales and purchases of energy on the system. And those entities are nowhere to be found in the plain language of PURA. And so, if we lacked authority to regulate any entity that was not in that list, we would lack authority over QSEs, and that just doesn't work, right? And self-generators is another species of entity out there that is just not listed in PURA. Again, I think a counterpoint to the argument that we should strictly construe 151J as implicitly foreclosing a regulation of other entities not specified. The other primary provision that TIC is pointing to is 39151 subsection L, which prohibits requirements that adversely affect or impede any manufacturing or other internal process operation associated with an industrial generation facility, except to the minimum extent necessary to assure the reliability of the transmission network. And it's that last clause that is really critical because the legislature obviously recognized the importance of ensuring reliability, but of course this provision doesn't even in the first instance suggest that we cannot impose requirements on customers as a general argument. If that were true, this provision wouldn't be necessary at all. So, we think that argument from redundancy clearly rebuts the argument that TIC made that we have no authority to regulate customers. As Caitlin indicated, TIC has proposed an alternative. We just don't think that that's really a sufficient solution to the significant ride-through risk that we're seeing. And that proposal was to convert the requirements in NOGR 282 into non-binding guidelines. We think there's an obvious defect there because if customers are not required to comply with these requirements, then they really aren't any good. If the law cannot impose a binding requirement on an entity, then it doesn't do anything. And relying on the TDSPs to manage that relationship also doesn't work because we can't assure that we're going to have consistent standards from service area to service area. The primary risk that we're trying to address here is a risk to frequency. So you have a voltage excursion or a frequency excursion that leads to the trip of the load, which causes overfrequencies on the system, and that can cause the trip of generators or other loads on the system. And that's the risk we're talking about. That's a system-wide phenomenon that only ERCOT, as the balancing authority, as the independent system operator for the entire ERCOT region, has the legal capacity, the structural capacity to resolve. The individual utilities do not have that visibility, that capability, or that legal duty to manage system frequency. And that's why this is appropriate as a system-wide requirement, not as a TDSP-specific service area requirement. So in a nutshell, that's our position on the law, and we believe that ERCOT has this authority, and for that reason that the board has sufficient grounding for recommending approval of these revision requests.
Thanks, Nathan and Jeff. Any questions for Nathan?
Yeah.
Peggy.
Yeah, just quickly, just to summarize, I think I got this correct. I just want to clarify that the PURA 39151J, which is the operative argument, it does not limit ERCOT's authority over the listed entities. And you said that we have many protocols that go beyond that list. And presumably the industrials were part of developing those protocols. Is that correct?
I looked at the voting records, but certainly the industrial consumers have been part of the stakeholder process here at ERCOT that did approve dozens and dozens of requirements that would bear on qualified scheduling entities who are not explicitly included in that list, correct?
Right. And I understand TIEC also argues that ERCOT doesn't have the expertise to regulate in this area. What's our response to that?
So, I think expertise is always an important consideration, right? And that's why from my perspective, I think that's why we have a stakeholder process in order to gather that information, in order to develop the appropriate requirements. Similarly, the PUC has a notice and comment process where they can collect feedback on a proposal, get that feedback, consider it, and develop and improve that proposal as it materializes. ERCOT doesn't have direct knowledge of generator mechanics either, right? And yet we have regulated generator ride-through for many years, and so we've relied on information from the market to inform those standards, and we take that very seriously. We made that very clear when we set out with this proposal in mid-November to collect that feedback. We have collaborated with many members of the data center industry to develop these requirements and made a number of changes based on that feedback. And so we think that is critical and essential. But certainly, ERCOT structurally is not in a position to have firsthand knowledge of these issues. Our job is to ensure grid reliability, but that requires cooperation with the owners of these facilities to ensure that these requirements are reasonable, that they are taking into consideration the capabilities of these assets, and so that they ultimately make sense to promote growth in the ERCOT region in a way that maintains reliability.
Do I see a hand over here? Yes, Chris.
Just, Nathan, you mentioned NERC. Can you tell us a little bit about where they stand on requirements around this issue and how we may or may not line up?
Right. So NERC appears to be in the very early stages of regulating these risks. Back in September of last year, they had issued a level 2 NERC alert and had requested a significant amount of information from entities around the country as to the current status of their information gathering and regulatory efforts. And that initial NERC alert was issued because of some of these large load trips that had been observed around the country, including at least one event here in Texas. And so those events quickly raised alarms at NERC, and following that level 2 alert, they announced an effort to initiate a regulatory framework for large computational loads, as they're calling them. And they are in the process of trying to zero in on definitions for the computational load entities that will be subject to these regulations, and to really establish a scope for the regulatory changes that are coming. The initial phase of reliability standards that NERC is currently contemplating include standards that deal with modeling, communications, interconnection processes, commissioning, that sort of thing. They have issued a level 3 alert in early May. That is only the third level 3 alert issued in NERC's history, indicating a significant concern that entities, RCs and BAs, reliability coordinators, balancing authorities, that these entities need to take these actions, they're essential actions as defined in this NERC alert, to ensure the reliability of the grid. And a lot of that involves modeling, involves commissioning, communication processes, and NERC views those as kind of the building blocks, the foundation for a framework on which they can establish other standards. Ride-through risk is certainly one of the issues that they have identified. There are a couple of white papers that have informed these efforts, and so it definitely appears that NERC is moving in the direction of regulating ride-through, but I think my understanding is that they are in the process of doing additional research to evaluate appropriate requirements, and if they at the appropriate time, they may proceed in phase 2 next year with some additional requirements. But I don't think ride-through is in scope for phase 1. It's really about establishing the foundational regulatory framework, including registration of computational loads for the purposes of those regulations.
Chair Gleason.
Yeah.
So Nathan, just to be clear, nothing in TIEC's comments contends that this is an issue that doesn't need to be addressed. They just say that it should not be addressed in the manner you all are recommending.
I think that's accurate. They agree that this is a reliability risk. They suggest that it should be addressed in a different manner. However, we believe it needs to be addressed in a manner that ensures that it is resolved and isn't left open.
Okay, thank you.
If we don't have any other questions, we'll go ahead and put this matter up for consideration. As I previously mentioned, this is a board priority item. So I'll entertain a motion to adopt NPR 1308 as recommended by TAC and to adopt NOGR 282 as modified by the May 11th, 2026 ERCOT comments. Bill's made the motion. John has seconded. Is all in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay. NPR 1308, NOGR 208 are approved. Now we're going to go back to Caitlin, and we're going to talk about agenda item 15.1.2.1, DOGR 283, which is a board priority related to NPR 1309, Dispatchable Reliability Reserve Ancillary Service, and agenda item 15.1.2.2, which is NPR 1309 itself, the Dispatchable Reliability Reserve Ancillary Service. So Caitlin, please proceed.
Okay. NPR 1309 develops DRRS as an ancillary service. We've talked about this one a lot. It's the implementation of a service created by the legislature. We are currently holding off on DRRS Plus, which was an additional NPR, until the reliability standard study talks. And then, as I noted earlier, we have ESR participation in DRS and a separate new NPRR. So this creates the ancillary service, the demand curve for it, all of that. And then the other thing that we have added to this NPRR is reducing the non-spin duration requirement from 4 hours to 2 hours upon implementation of this service, which would likely also be a 4-hour service. NPR 1309 was endorsed by TAC at the April 29th TAC meeting. We had actually 5 no votes and 1 abstention, opposing votes from the independent generator and cooperative segments, and an additional abstention also from the cooperative segment. It sounds like a lot of no votes, but I do think this is a pretty good success story. We went into the meeting actually with 2 different substantive issues that I would say were still at odds. So, thinking about two issues where people are potentially no's, that could be 8 to 10 no's. So I think we did a pretty good job with this one. We had a robust discussion regarding what the shortage pricing floor should be. So when we don't procure enough, this floor kicks in. Originally, it was set to 1 penny. And then after some discussion at PRS, ERCOT revised their position to a $10 price floor. That's ultimately what TAC voted through, but we did get some initial pushback on that floor level from consumers. And so we took a first vote with the penny price floor that failed. The other big issue heading into TAC was the non-spin duration. So sort of reverse of that, coming out of PRS, we had agreed to keep non-spin at the 4-hour duration, even upon implementation of DRRS, but we heard from ERCOT and the IMM and commission staff support for moving that duration to 2 hours, the thought being that DRRS will cover the needs for a 4-hour service. The opposing votes left were due to changing the non-spin duration from 4 hours to 2 hours. One of the comments was that, lowering that duration was not necessary to implementation of DRRS, and that doing so may actually be counter to the statute, which has a goal of reducing RUCs. On that issue, commenters also felt that lowering the duration for non-spin may be premature, as ERCOT has discretion on the duration of DRRS. It could actually be more than 4 hours. And then additionally, opposing voters felt that DRRS, even without DRRS Plus, should further the goal of a reliability standard and not just address operational uncertainty. And NOGR 283 goes along with 1309 and has the same voting record.
Okay, thank you, Caitlin. And while we invite Keith to come up and give ERCOT comments on NPR 1309, I want to go back to agenda item 15.1.1.4 for a minute and to state for the record that the board received written comments from SB Energy and also from the Texas Industrial Consumers regarding the large computational load ride-through requirements revision request. Both sets of comments were included in the meeting materials today, and as far as I understand, there were no other comments or requests for public comment on that. Is that correct, Jeff?
That's correct, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Just want to make sure that was in the record. So, Keith, you're going to now present the ERCOT comments on NPR 1309.
All right, yes. I'll be brief here, but Caitlin did cover some of the items that I wanted to know. Yep.
Keith, could you give us the page number in Diligent?
Page number in Diligent is 357.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay, so just very briefly, there's a sequence of NPRs. Caitlin mentioned this. It was mentioned before. The only thing I will note is that the ESR NPR is 1340. 1340 is the new one, and it was filed last week. So really, and again, this is just to highlight some of the comments that Caitlin made. There are just a few items of where some of the contention was in the stakeholder process. I just want to cover these quickly. The first one had to do with the use of the ancillary service demand curve for the DRS product. As you know, this is an area of discussion a lot last year in terms of how we were going to utilize demand curves in the real-time co-optimization. This does change how things have been done historically. One of the changes that was made in the process that was a just joint discussion between ERCOT and the IMM was to craft what that demand curve would look like. There was some debate and discussion around whether or not that should or should not be utilized. I think our view, along with the IMM's view, was that to incorporate it as a way to ensure that the proper sequencing of the reserves would happen appropriately in the real-time co-optimization process, and that's where this construct came from. There were others that felt that the curve should rest outside of that process, but us, along with the IMM, felt that this was appropriate. Secondly, as Caitlin did cover, there was discussions around what a floor would look like, and ultimately there were different views. There was a view that it should be consistent with what is used with non-spin at $15. There was a view that it should be at a penny, and the ERCOT view was that at $10 for the floor would be a sweet spot in terms of not being in conflict with what we were doing with the other reserve products, but also recognizing that the penny floor wasn't sufficient enough. And then finally, the duration requirement. Again, this was something that was a part of the joint proposal that ERCOT and the IMM had crafted that did highlight the reduction of the non-spin duration. But I do want to note that while we did indicate that duration was something that we felt could go to 2 hours, there was still needs for a study to determine what the requirement would be for non-spin as associated with that particular point. So those were the 3 points of contention along with this NPR, but I'm happy to answer any questions that folks may have.
Does the board have any questions for Keith? All right. Courtney, I'm sorry.
Yeah, this is Keith and Caitlin, maybe just depending. First, can you walk through why we're in a protocol on DRRS and we're looking at non-spin, a totally different ancillary service? Like, I'm confused why those two are actually being commingled. And then yesterday, we had a big discussion on the PCR and how that number and using that is really something we need to look at because of battery state of charge. And so with that being what we're thinking about and with that being what we're seeing in the market, why would we be looking at changing non-spin from 4 hour to 2 hour?
Okay. So the question is, well, why is non-spin a part of this? And the big reason for that has to do with the fact that the DRRS duration is 4 hours, and there was some overlap between what non-spin today is doing at 4 hours, and if you were to implement a DRS with a 4 hour duration, is there potential double counting of the non-spin, what that's trying to do, and what DRS is trying to do? And the reality is there is some overlap. It is not a perfect overlap, and so the feeling was that for a requirement of DRS at 4 hours, you could cover some of the concern with the DRS product for the 4 hour duration, and then the non-spin duration being at a lower duration would cover the remaining concerns, but still the requirement would need to be determined, but the duration could operate at that 2 hours with the duration of DRS at the 4 hours. So hopefully that gives you a sense as to why this was discussed.
It does, but if you can also talk about yesterday when we talked about PRS and the state of charge and that being even more of a concern, again, it seems we wouldn't want to have shorter duration of an ancillary service because we're worried about not having enough of a certain state of charge.
And I think there's, again, I think that there, to the extent that there's some overlap in terms of what the DRS would cover, to the extent that the non-spin duration, even at the shorter period, you can cover with requirement, not necessarily duration. So again, there's different ways to slice this up, but I think ERCOT did feel comfortable that you could cover the needs with the DRS at 4 hours, and as we do our study, determine what type of requirement would come out of what kind of requirement for non-spin and what kind of requirement for the DRS could cover the remainder of the needs. Okay.
Any other questions? Okay. For the board's knowledge, the board didn't receive any requests for comment in person under this agenda item. So as a reminder, DOGR 283 is a board priority revision request. If there's no further discussion, I'll entertain a motion to adopt NPR 1309 and NOGR 283. Thanks, John. Second by Kathleen. All in favor? Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, those are adopted. Move on to the next agenda item, which is agenda item 15.1.3, NPR 1315, changes to the process of evaluating the potential needs for additional capacity and mitigated offer cap. Caitlin, please give us your update on this.
Okay. 1315 is what we've been calling contracts for capacity. Keith will go through this. ERCOT has really good information on this. In the past, they have issued 4 contracts for capacity since the fall of 2023. These have not been able to procure any capacity. You know, the RFPs have been sort of a shock to the system for stakeholders, pretty unusual when we first saw one in 2023, and they could only be issued the season ahead, so it's a short time frame to respond, and then a short contract, so it's not, you know, like a normal PPA a generator would do. So ERCOT sought to codify this authority and kind of extend the length that they could look out to have a contract. You know, for certain areas of the grid, this is a tool in the toolbox that ERCOT needs. So making sure the process for procurement is narrow and transparent is really the goal for stakeholders here. As I said, NPR 1315 codified the process, expanded the time frame. ERCOT could look ahead and say they need contracts for up to 2 years, clarifies settlements, specifies that we're looking at local or regional constraint issues, revises the mitigated offer cap for these issues. We did vote to recommend approval of 1315. We had a robust discussion at TAC, mostly around doing this regional versus for system-wide capacity and making sure the language was consistent. There was a lot of robust discussion leading up to TAC, I think a couple of dedicated workshops. And I think this one was a good example of collaboration with ERCOT. As I said, you know, sort of the knee-jerk reaction was kind of, no way, contracts for capacity is not what we do. This is a market where generators risk their own investment, and that's how we ultimately get reliability, and we shouldn't have contracts and prices that interfere with that. But, you know, we have situations with the fast-paced load growth, and ERCOT needs the reliability tool for that. So Keith and his team did a really good job of working with stakeholders to narrow this and also to look at price formation in a way that hopefully prices could tell us about these situations in advance and then during as well. We had just one opposing vote. We had 5 abstentions. We had one person who said, I hate this, but yes. So, you know, I think it's just something where we had to collaborate with ERCOT, and I think it was a good result. The opposing vote was really about wanting more checks and balances to prevent the overuse of contracts for capacity. The contracts would get PUC approval and I believe board approval before being entered into, but they wanted to see more ex-ante approval, use of the same consistent load forecasts, that kind of thing. And then also a lot of discussion about price formation, a discrete issue about including the contract for capacity and the price adders, and I believe that'll be addressed in a subsequent MPRR or current MPRR.
That reminds me of my days in Congress. I hate this, but yes. Okay.
It was a very good vote.
For speaker flow control, I think the IMM had concerns about this one. So, Jeff, if you'd like to comment, head toward the podium, and we'll get you queued up here in a second. Any questions for Caitlin on this?
It'll take the whole time to get the podium tall enough for Jeff.
Look, Keith Collins is going to present ERCOT's comments, and then Jeff will queue you up after that.
Okay. Not to reiterate, I'll just cover some points. I know Caitlin made some good points here, but the first thing is that this process has been something that we studied and evaluated based on what we had seen come out of previous MRA and contract for capacity practices. And what we found was, as part of the lessons learned, that particularly the timing of this is a bit of a challenge, and so it was important to reconsider some things in order to make it more effective. So there were existing processes to some extent, and how can we make those processes better? And so there was a lot of discussion and collaboration throughout the stakeholder process. What started was changed and modified and added to, and we will be working on a subsequent NPR 1214 that will hopefully address some of the problems and issues that were identified in this process, but not captured explicitly in 1315. So there were several modifications that are coming out of NPR 1315, notification requirements, extending the horizon, revisions to the mitigated offer cap. So there was a series of things that were done to help make some improvements in the processes as we move forward. The benefits, as Caitlin noted, and I alluded to, is particularly giving it more runway. It's hard when we look out one season and the process doesn't allow for much turnaround time, and so it was a classic example of the process was such that it would essentially be designed to not promote any resources in these processes. And so by giving us more time, we think it'll be more successful, and some of the changes will minimize some of the distortions that we see that could occur without the change. As Caitlin noted, it wasn't unanimous, as you know. The IMM will have some comments here, but I do want to stress that this was, I think, a really good example of again, there may be some disdain in the process, but there was a lot of discussion and collaboration that went along with trying to make something work and workable, and I think we found something that worked for us and for the stakeholders. And if it's something that moves forward, is something that is likely to be used as part of the Far West, should it be deemed appropriate. So that's the end of my comments, and happy to take any questions.
Okay. Any questions for Keith? All right. Thanks, Keith. The board didn't request for any in-person comments under this agenda item. We've noted that the independent market monitor opposed NPR 1315 during the stakeholder process. And Jeff, would you spend a couple of minutes? 3 minutes, okay, to share your perspectives?
Yeah, thank you. And I would like to commend ERCOT and the stakeholders in the process for, I agree with Keith, there were improvements that were made during the process, and it's always nice to see that happen. At the end of the day, so I recognize that for local areas, it can be a circumstance where a contracted capacity is necessary in order to preserve reliability. The main, I guess, dispute that we had with where this landed was with the system level, being able to contract at a system level for anticipated emergencies. And this folds back into, what I've been discussing for quite a while, which is the ERCOT system needs to experience relative shortages in order to get prices higher, in order to incent new investment. If you go out and front run that from happening so that you're contracting ahead of the shortages resulting in higher in-market revenues and incenting new generation, then you've disturbed that process. You not only disturbed price formation, but you also suppressed the incentive process for new generation. And so the issue that we really had was that there wasn't, in our view, enough specificity around what would constitute an emergency circumstance in order for forward procurement for system-level emergencies to take place. I'm hoping that as subsequent processes evolve, that we'll be able to get that to be more specific, because I would like to make sure that those assessments do allow for enough increase in revenue that the Texas market model can work. And that's it.
Thank you, Jeff. Woody, did you? Jeff,
Hey,
don't
Jeff.
leave. Don't leave. You get another minute.
Quick question. If we were to use this tool and we resettle the market, would that take care of the problem? I mean, if you rerun the market as if this generation wasn't there, wouldn't you still get the prices that you need as a signal?
So that's an interesting. I think there's two components to that. One is if you're forward contracting, you'd have to rerun it persistently, and so that wouldn't be because of a RUC or an FFSS call. That would be just you would be basically running two markets persistently for the duration of these contracts. So what that does is it would kind of create two different prices. It also, I think this is a reasonable assertion, is from a developer perspective, I haven't developed yet. I'm looking for price signals. I see that you're rerunning in order to get those price signals in there, but I'm wondering, when is that going to end? Because we now have two different markets. We've got this lower priced market, and Texas consumers are paying for the contracted energy, and I've got this higher priced market that comes out of a simulation, and I can see those. It's providing a signal. But when is that going to end? When is that, is it 3 or 4 or 5 contracts before it's determined that that's just too much that's too much if we're already paying for the generation. It's just too much to put on consumers to pay for that and then also pay the higher price. I think allowing the price to come up, and again, it really comes down to what would constitute an emergency for you. If I would imagine at a system level, any reasonable determination of an emergency circumstance that would trigger this type of capacity contracting, you could easily demonstrate that it would be a very high price in that scenario. It would produce a very high, maybe not all the time, obviously, but high enough during peak periods. So I think from an investment signal perspective, having one market, one price is better. I understand at some point reliability takes over. I'm just hoping enough specificity can be provided that we can determine that that's at a very high level.
Okay, any other questions for Jeff?
I hate to do it, but I needed that. A quick question. Hopefully, you can give me a quick response. You said at the beginning, that the ERCOT market needs to experience relative shortages. What is the meaning of relative there? Are you just saying we need to experience shortages?
Yes, that's a good question. So I was asked a question in the fall if I was implying that the lights need to go out in terms of, in order for the market to function. And so I start using the term relative shortage because that wasn't at all what I was implying. I was just implying that the ERCOT system needs to experience more tightness and some shortage in its reserve capacity that's available in order to trigger higher prices in the shortage pricing mechanism. They call them the ASDCs, the ancillary service demand curves. And so relative shortage might mean I have 10% less reserves than I need, or 15% less reserves than I need for a period of hours during certain periods during the year.
Okay, thank you, Jeff.
Thank you.
I think we've had a pretty robust discussion on this one. If there's no further discussion, I'll entertain a motion to adopt NPR 1315.
So moved.
Thank you, Peggy. Second from Chris. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, 1315 has been adopted. Now for the big enchilada. Caitlin, please proceed with agenda item 15.1.4, the batch zero process for large load interconnections. This is NPR 1325 and a bigger 145.
Okay, it is the big enchilada. This is so important that our former TAC chair, Cliff, is listening, so hello to Cliff. But again, this one was unopposed, so thank you to ERCOT and stakeholders, and especially Martha Henson. This took a lot of work, and I think the outcome was pretty phenomenal. We did have one abstention, and then the MPRR related to it was unanimous. So even better, no abstentions and no no's. That's 1325. Quickly, 1325 defines essential terminology related to transitional large load interconnection process, the batch zero process, and modifies the RPG procedures. So going back to PIGR 145, there is a lot in this. ERCOT has an extensive presentation on all the things included in this PIGR, so I don't think I'll go through these. As Pablo said earlier, a lot of the time was spent on the eligibility framework. So, within all load requests, we were creating 3 categories. So base load for batch zero, those are loads that don't need to be restudied and get the full allocation of their request. And then 2, studied load for batch zeros, those will get some allocation, and then loads that are not included is the 3rd group. So I would say, that added a sort of unusual aspect to this, that we were trying to develop policy in a situation where there are immediate winners and losers. So there are a lot of fairness questions raised as well as policy questions in the process. And so it's sort of difficult to determine when, we just have to move on and make the best policy we can. But as you know, we spent an extraordinary amount of time in the stakeholder process on this revision request. ERCOT had many workshops, and then by design, we had the PIGR 145 at several meetings for each voting stakeholder bodies, so at PRS and at Ross and at TAC multiple times. And again, thank you to ERCOT and Martha and commission staff for their coordination on this. Between the last 2 TAC meetings where we considered this, we had about 15 new sets of comments from ERCOT and from stakeholders. And the alert is that PIGR 145 has passed the record for filed documents in a revision request that was previously held by NOGR 245. So we passed a record, and I think that's great. But I'm not going to work on any more revision requests that end in 45. But at the last meeting, we discussed several issues. One was regarding inclusion of projects that had been processed in certain RPG projects instead of through the individual LLIS. There was an issue regarding the study date by which a project could submit studies and have it guaranteed to be reviewed by ERCOT. There was an issue around projects that would be net metered with existing generation. There were still quite a few concerns about specific criteria to show project maturity as well as the fees. And then I would say a recurring theme that we'll continue to hear about was around the treatment and setup for projects that bring their own generation or are CLRs, and should they have fast pass or different treatment for getting allocated rather than a load that needs always complete firm service. So those are things I think you'll continue to hear about. And you're going to hear more from ERCOT and I believe one stakeholder right now. So I'm done, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay. Any questions for Caitlin? Don't go too far. We may need you back. So thank you.
All right.
All right. We're going to ask Jeff Bellow to come up and present ERCOT comments on MPR 1325 and PIGR 145.
So before I get into the details on PIGR 145, I just wanted to take a moment to appreciate how we got to where we're at today. And I think Pablo did a good job earlier of giving commendations to those who helped get us here. I did want to highlight a few specific call-outs. First, at the February 6th open meeting, Chairman Gleason gave us the goal of being here at the June board meeting with revision requests, and that was sort of our put a man on the moon by the end of the decade moment. And we rallied internally. Matt Marinas led an effort to really gather and put together a plan of stakeholder engagement. And I want to call out Caitlin and Martha Henson, TAC leadership, who helped support that stakeholder engagement plan. And so we obviously had a lot of engagement with stakeholders where they were really plugged into this. And we got a lot of good feedback, as Caitlin mentioned, record number of filings on the PIGR. And that really helped us to sharpen the revision request as we went along. I also want to specifically call out A.G. Springer, Christina Switzer, and Evan Rowe. Pablo mentioned that we had folks who worked very late nights and weekends to make this happen. And so we could have met that goal by just slapping something together and getting it here. But those three individuals in particular, we did not ask them to work those kinds of hours. We don't expect our employees to do that, but they did anyway because they wanted to make sure that what we brought was quality. And so I want to thank them for that. And then also, and Pablo had a slide with the 28 or 30 people who were involved, but this was not just those individuals. This was really across the company. Really, everybody was aligned on knowing that this was important and making sure that we got here. And so just a couple of examples is when I have materials that I have to submit for the board, Kim and Penny were gracious in letting me miss my deadlines and get those in late. When my team asked JP's team for virtual machines because we wanted to start running pilots to make sure that what we had written down, we could actually produce those results. We could run those engineering studies, so we started running engineering pilots, and so they stood up in a process that normally takes months. They stood up 10 virtual machines in a couple of weeks to allow us to do that. So anyway, just wanted to thank those folks, and I think one of our core values at ERCOT is better together, and really demonstrated that through this effort. So with that, I want to get into the details and really restate the problem statement, which is that our existing process really was not designed for the volume of large load interconnection requests that we have been experiencing. And we've seen that. I've presented this slide numerous times, but it's really the issue of we have these projects that are studied individually, and that creates certain problems when we're trying to make sure that we can serve all of this load reliably. And it causes us to have to go back and do a bunch of restudies, and that has created uncertainty for the developers. There are also projects that just have not been able to get through that process. And so we have this issue where we need to move away from that to more of a batch process.
For a minute?
Yeah, please.
We've seen this a couple of times. Does the board want to go through it again? If you do, I'm fine. But Pablo and Chad, are you okay? Okay. I think we've covered this, so.
Okay.
Okay.
Right.
So go to the next one. Okay, thanks.
And I think Pablo covered this really well, so I won't go into details on the building blocks that is in the PIGR. I did want to talk about the eligibility because that is the issue that really bubbled up a lot during the stakeholder process. And if you think about eligibility as we've defined in PIGR 145, there's really sort of a couple of filters there. So one is the study filters. How were those projects so there's 400 something gigawatts out there I presented yesterday that have requested interconnection. Where are those projects at in the study process? And so that was one filter. We wanted to make sure that we were, again, this is a transitional batch. So batch 1 will be open for anybody to participate, but for batch 0, we needed to have a more narrow focus. And so we wanted to focus on projects that were mature in that study process. And then the other filter is really around more project readiness and looking at things like financial commitment, site control, and those sorts of things. And so based on those, there are 3 individual kind of categories that each load will be put into. One is base load, which means you've requested 1,000 megawatts. We've shown through the studies we can reliably serve that 1,000 megawatts. You have a green light to connect those 1,000 megawatts to the system. studied load category is you've requested 1,000 megawatts, but through batch zero, we will determine by year how much of that can we reliably serve, and we will come up with a transmission plan to get your full megawatts. And then the majority of load will be in that excluded load bucket, and that means that for batch zero, for this transition, you're not included in that in this particular study, but you are eligible for inclusion in a later batch. And so I mentioned those study pathways, and there's really 6. I'm going to walk through each of these. So one is obviously if you have previously energized, you have gone through a previous interconnection process, those loads will be included as base load in batch zero. And then the next category are those loads that are almost energized. So they have gone through a previous interconnection study process. They are almost energized, and we're measuring that by looking at whether they are in the quarterly stability assessment or they were in last winter. We went through this interim voltage write-through. So those are for loads that are almost energized, and so those would also be included as batch zero. And then there are those projects that were included. Those loads were included in a regional planning group project. So those loads led to the need for an RPG project, such as the ones that the board endorsed yesterday. And so if those studies are valid, and I'll talk about what that means in a minute, if those studies are valid, then that load is eligible to be base load. If the study is not valid, then they would be studied load. And so what does valid mean? Valid means that when we look at that study, it includes all other large loads that have a valid study, that those loads were included in that study. And so that means that we know that we can reliably, from a transmission perspective, we can reliably serve that load as well as all other loads that have come before them in the process. So that's what we mean by valid studies. We have to check to make sure all of those other loads were included in that study. And then a study that is RPG-like was the Permian Basin Reliability Plan, which the Commission approved that transmission plan in 2024. So that any loads that were included in that study, again, this is an RPG-like study, that is a valid study for those loads to come in and be connected, and so those loads would be eligible for base load treatment. And then obviously we have the legacy large load interconnection study process, either the previous interim process or the current Figure 115 process. Loads that go through that process, if they have a valid study, then those loads will be included as base load or eligible for base load in batch zero. If they, again, same validity criteria, if they don't have a valid study, then they are eligible to be included as study load. And then finally, those projects that were included in a net metering arrangement that was filed with the Commission before March 4th, then that is their, for those loads, that is their valid study entry pathway into batch zero. So what does this look like in terms of gigawatts? I'm going to start with the bar chart. I'm going to start at the bottom. So in that first category, that 23.9 gigawatts, those are loads that have met they've completed the large load interconnection study process as of March 4th. And when we filed the figure, we did a check, and all of those loads had valid studies. And so all of those loads are eligible to be included as base load in batch zero. And then the second category are loads that have completed that interconnection process since March 4th, between March 4th and May 19th when we took this snapshot. And some of those, we have looked at those and we have said your studies are valid. So that's 7.4 gigawatts. Some of those we have said your studies are not valid, and so we've sent that information back to the TSP and told them that they need to maybe do some do that restudy of those loads with additional loads that they did not include in the study originally. And there are some loads that are met that criteria, but we're still evaluating those. And then as you work up the list, I won't read all of the different categories here. There are loads that have some study completion, but maybe have not met all of their requirements. And so that's how we stack the bar chart to get to the 400-something gigawatts that are in the process. And I also want to highlight that bucket 7 is most of those loads are actually included in the in the column on the right, the large load interconnection studies. But we are in the process of determining which of those 6 buckets each of those loads will fall in ultimately. And then just because this has come up in the comments, I want to just take a minute to walk through what we refer to as the ladder methodology, which is that we have, as we are looking at that study validity issue, the way that we are determining that is by when your valid study was completed. And so we will order those, and so you see the first step is just to order as those studies come in. We're going to order them, and then we will start at the top of the list, and we will work down the list and see, okay, did your study, did it include all other large loads that were ahead of you on the list? And so when we get to the first one, RPGA, loads 1 and 2, they're at the top of the list, so they pass that test. The next study had everything, the next study had everything, but when we get to what we refer to as LLIS load 2, maybe it did not include, their study did not include LLIS load 1, and they're in the same area. So they would fail that validity check, and then the TSP would need to go back and add that load in and restudy that, and if they accomplish that by July 10th, then they are allowed to pass that test. And so this is, again, important from a reliability perspective. We can't let more load onto the system than we know that we have studied that we can reliably serve from a transmission perspective. Then I want to shift gears here to the PCLR and the WL-PUN. I'm going to start on the right-hand side and then go backwards and work left. So if you remember yesterday, if you were at TNS, you heard NVIDIA talk about this concept of flexible loads and loads that can come in and be flexible. And so maybe there are some number of hours of the year where they have to reduce their consumption, but most of the year they can consume the full amount that they want to consume. And the framework that we put in place to allow that is the PCLR framework. And so that is where the load is actually dispatchable. So as we see transmission constraints on the system, they can actually move down. So as an example, if they have a 150 megawatt load, and we see that we can only reliably serve 100 megawatts with the transmission system, then they would be dispatchable to where maybe most days they can consume that 150, but if we see transmission constraints, then our SCED system will automatically back them down. They have to be able to receive that signal and automatically back down to 100 megawatts to preserve the reliability of the system. And so when we initially filed the PICR and NPRR on March 4th, on April 17th, we filed comments that added into that PICR. This is not a separate PICR. This is included in that PICR 145 and NPR 1325. We included those comments that would allow that PCLR to happen. And then on May 2nd, we added the WL-PUN construct, which is Withdrawal Limited Private Use Network. And that allows loads to get credit for bringing new generation with them to where we would allow them to connect more megawatts to the system. It's not a fast pass to be able to connect to the system faster. It just means that they can more quickly, they can consume the load that they want. So as an example, if they have a 1,000 megawatt load, but the system can really only accommodate 100 megawatts because of transmission constraints, if they're also bringing 1,000 megawatts of generation, then where before if they didn't bring that generation, we would limit them to 100 megawatts. If they're bringing generation, they can connect the full 1,000 megawatts and just make sure that they're operating in such a way that they would never consume more than 100 megawatts from the grid. So they're able to connect more load quicker in that way. Again, introduce that concept on May 2nd. And to Caitlin's point earlier, I think we have a lot of stakeholders that had a lot of ideas for how to enhance both PCLR and WL-PUN. I think we're really interested in those ideas, but we're not able to get those in for Batch 0, but we'll be working on that going forward. And just on the study timeline for Batch 0, so I've got more details on what's coming up in the next couple of months, but essentially the study will start in August, and we will run, we've actually already started building the models for Batch 0, but we will start running those models in September once the cases are completely built, and we will also be running stability studies. And then on April 9th is when we will come out with our final report. And then that starts that 60-day window for the developers to make their commitment to determine if they want to move forward and accept the megawatt allocations and the financial commitments that are required at that time. So that's high level. I do want to pause here and mention I don't have a separate slide on our impact analysis, but because we are taking work and we are doing this additional study work for building the models, running the steady state analysis, running the stability analysis, that is an additional FTE impact on ERCOT. So our IA is for 18 FTEs to accomplish that work. And in addition to that, we have, I think it's a 300K to 400K project to enable the PCLR so that we can integrate that into our systems. So that's what's in that IA. I think I'll also note on the impact analysis is while what's in Figure 145 is just for a single batch zero study, we are anticipating that we will be moving into a ongoing batch study process, and so those FTEs are really anticipated to move and continue on in the ongoing batch work. So
I'd like to ask a question.
Yep.
On
ahead,
slide
Jim.
7, I'm just trying to summarize at a very high level. Your batch zero is going to model roughly 450 gigawatts of load.
Batch zero, let me go back to this. So for that 400 and something gigawatts of load, each of those we will categorize as either base load,
right,
studied load, or excluded load. Right now, we're expecting that between the base load and the studied load, that's going to be, from a study perspective, that's roughly 100 gigawatts, maybe a little bit more than 100 gigawatts that would be eligible from a study perspective. Now, there is also that filter of financial commitments and site control requirements and those other project readiness milestones that are in the figure. Right now, we don't know how much of that load will qualify under that financial commitment because it have not gotten to that deadline yet to provide that financial commitment piece.
Okay, well, my question was going to be, how does the size in gigawatts of batch zero compare to the existing models for our existing transmission system?
Yeah, so this load would be in addition to and these are, I think, 2032 numbers here. So let's say it's 100 gigawatts that come in as base load and studied load. Right now, our 2032 forecast, I think, is 110-ish gigawatts. And so this would put us a little over 200 gigawatts of total load in the model. And again, that's assuming that all of it qualifies from a financial commitment perspective. And so to put that in reference to previous studies, I think our RTP last year was in the 150 to 160 gigawatt range. So it is a jump above the RTP. So we have started, we call the batch zero readiness meetings with stakeholders. So that we are having meetings on a weekly basis to get them prepared for the deadlines that are coming up and making sure that they understand what is, Figure 145 it's a long document. It has a lot of requirements, and so we want to make sure that they are prepared and know exactly what the deadlines are for them to submit their information and what information is going to be required for them to submit to us. It also, we are putting together some forms, some standard forms that when people are sending in, when the TSPs are sending in these attestations that are required, that making sure that they have kind of a standard forms that we're receiving some consistency in those. And so we started those meetings on May 15th. We'll continue until, I think, July 9th is our last readiness meeting. So we're anticipating board approval today. commission approval afterwards, and then with that, the existing process will end on July 10th, and that is also the deadline for the developers to submit all of their information to the TSPs and DSPs. And then the TSPs and DSPs have 2 weeks to gather that information and package it up, send it to ERCOT on July 24th. And then we have 2 weeks to review that. And so our deadline to send that information back and notify the TSPs and DSPs which loads will be included as base load, which are study load, and which are excluded. Our deadline to make that notification is August 7th. So that is the date in which we will sort of know that exactly how much is it 100 gigawatts, is it 50 gigawatts, how much is actually qualified is on August 7th, with the asterisks there that there is a cure period. If the model information that they sent us, if there's deficiencies in that model, then we've given them a cure period until the end of August. And so there could be some that aren't able to get us that information that would then fall out. But we think we'll have a pretty good idea of where that load is going to be around August 7th. And then last thing I had is just to talk a little bit about some of the issues that were raised at TAC. I think Caitlin laid it out pretty well. But won't go into a lot of detail on these, but did want to highlight that we had some discussions about, and it was really about, all three of these are really about changing eligibility requirements as we have laid them out in Figure 1 to 45. And there's, again, various versions of this, but they are around opening that up so that additional loads would be able to qualify to get into batch zero. As we were just discussing, we are already, just with the requirements that we already have 100 gigawatts or so that would be eligible to be included, and so we think that that's a reasonable limitation for the study. And so with that, I'll pause and see if there are any questions for me.
Chairman Gleason.
Thank you, Jeff. Not a question, just maybe for the last time, because I know you don't love to have praise put upon you, but you're always generous with thanking everyone else. But I want to say again that I view you and Barksdale together as the linchpin that held all this together, and your willingness to meet with and meaningfully engage with all stakeholders with all different perspectives on every one of these issues is really the reason that we're here today, and you deserve a lot of thanks and praise for everything you've done in this process.
Thank you.
And just maybe one more thing really quickly. Typically, we take 30 days between board approval and bringing this to the commission. Assuming the board approves this today, it would be my intention to put this on the June 18th open meeting for the PUC to deliberate this issue.
Thanks, Chair Gleason. Any other questions or comments for Jeff? Okay, I don't see any. All right, Jeff, thank you for that. The board received 2 sets of written comments from Cholla Inc., which are included in the meeting materials. Gordon Powell is here to speak in person. I think Mr. Powell is over here on the right side. So, Mr. Powell, if you would, please proceed. Your comments were fairly comprehensive, so to the extent that you can just give us the highlights of those or anything, any new material that would be helpful.
Yes, I will not be reading those extremely nuanced and detailed comments. Oh, thank you. I am going to read something, but if I'm going too long, just tell me to shut up. Won't hurt my feelings. Chairman, board members, ERCOT staff, and fellow Texans. My name is Gideon Powell, and my family has spent 3 generations investing in Texas energy infrastructure. My granddad was a wildcatter. My late father, Lord W. Powell Jr., was one of the last of a dying breed of Texas wildcatters, and amongst the first of a new generation of energy wildcatters I find myself following in. Like thousands of Texas families before us, we live the same basic bargain that helped us build this state. Take risks when success is uncertain. Invest capital, build infrastructure that employs people, pay taxes, and help make energy more reliable and abundant. In 2018, when my team first applied for a 100-megawatt load interconnection, it sounded crazy to develop a powered land campus in West Texas. But the rules were clear. If we wanted to develop a large powered land campus for large compute users without unnecessarily burdening Texas ratepayers, we should build our own substation. So we did. And my wife and I personally guaranteed a letter of credit just months after the birth of our now 8-year-old daughter. I share that because it's one of the many examples that reinforces what has made Texas a great place to invest. Texas works when people can understand the rules, rely on the process, and make long-term investments in good faith. Fast forward to December 15th, 2025, when the current large load interconnection framework became memorialized in ERCOT's rules. ERCOT had more than 3 times the prior year's level of interconnection request. The ERCOT I first entered in 2018 had changed. The scale had changed, and Cholla recognized that the bar needed to be higher. That's why Cholla supports the intent of PIGR 145. ERCOT is an ecological system where generation and load must remain in balance every second of every day. Cholla appreciates the work of every single ERCOT staff member that they perform every single day, 24/7, to maintain the frequency that Texans need. My question today is about governance and transition consistency. Before asking that question, I want to acknowledge something positive. I appreciate the work ERCOT, Encore, and the stakeholders undertook to validate 150 megawatts of Project Venus load into Batch Zero base. The effort reinforced my belief that transparency, objective criteria, and collaborative problem solving strengthen the confidence in the ERCOT process. And it demonstrated that mature originating projects can be evaluated through objective criteria without reopening Batch Zero broadly, or invalidating previously approved studies, or undermining administratability. We believe that validation succeeded in part because of ERCOT's review of the Southern DFW project, which identified approximately 2.9 gigawatts of additional load-serving capability beyond the original planning assumptions. The board's approval of the 2024 RPG project suggests an even larger opportunity. ERCOT's review identified approximately 16 gigawatts of additional load-serving capability associated with those projects, more than 5 times the capacity identified through the Southern DFW validation effort. From my perspective, this is an important governance lesson. If objective validation successfully accommodated originating loads within the Southern DFW planning record without invalidating previously approved studies, then the same objective process should be applied to the loads associated with the 2024 RPG projects. Accordingly, I would respectfully ask the board to direct ERCOT to perform the same validation analysis for the 4 numbers RPG projects, 40, 42, 41, 43. Applying the same objective criteria and collaborative approach that successfully validated the first 150 megawatts of Project Venus and the other originating loads associated with the Southern DFW project. I would also respectfully ask that this work be completed on a timeline that gives effective loads a meaningful opportunity to satisfy the July 10th deadline for submitting supporting materials to the transmission service providers. Otherwise, projects that ultimately validate could be excluded from Batch Zero base due to timing constraints rather than substantive ineligibility. The questions before the board is this: are similarly situated projects, and more importantly, projects that follow the rules invested before the standards changed, being evaluated under the same objective and transparent standards? Years ago, and in our case 2023, many developers made substantial investments in Texas based on the ERCOT and TSP processes then in effect. Since then, ERCOT's been moving toward a new framework, while many projects remain in transition between those two worlds. So I respectfully ask, is the board satisfied that the objective criteria are governing project advancement today? That matters beyond any individual company. It matters because Texas needs serious developers willing to invest long-term infrastructure capital. Texas needs substantially more flexible load. I so appreciate the PCLR and the WPUN. That is one of the most pioneering and important things for every single electric grid on Earth. We also need new dispatchable generation, batteries, substations, transmission solutions, and the private capital willing to invest before every answer is obvious. It matters to communities waiting for infrastructure investment. It matters to future generators and developers deciding where to build. 3 years ago, in 2023, Cholla submitted load requests under the rules and processes then in effect. We followed the instructions, we made significant investments, and we submitted approximately 2,400 megawatts of load at our Venus site alone. To date, 150 megawatts has been validated into Batch Zero base, and for that we're grateful. We appreciate that outcome and view it as evidence that objective validation can successfully distinguish mature projects from speculative requests. We're not asking for special treatment. We're simply asking ERCOT to continue the same validation process and apply objective standards consistently to early credentialed loads that were relied upon in transmission planning. In many cases, originating loads help justify transmission investments and planning assumptions that ultimately benefited other loads and other projects. That is why consistent validation matters. Capital depends on trust. Trust that the rules are clear. Trust that standards are applied consistently. Trust that when Texas raises the bar, as it should, the transition is administered transparently and consistently. Cholla supports the high standards and the cleaning up of the queue. We support expanding the tools available to ERCOT so that they can enhance reliability and affordability for Texans. My ask is that Texas raises the bar in a way that protects reliability, protects ratepayers, and honors the serious stakeholders who invested early under the rules Texas gave them. Because the question before the board is not whether every project advances. The question is whether Texas continues to reward behaviors that help make ERCOT the most respected grid in the world. Early participation, planning visibility, capital commitment, infrastructure investment, and working collaboratively through RPG and planning processes with good faith engagement. If the board is confident these safeguards are in place, I'd appreciate understanding what objective criteria ERCOT is using to ensure projects are treated consistently. And if improvements are still needed, I'm confident Texans can address them openly, constructively, and in a manner that strengthens trust in the ERCOT and preserves the entrepreneurial spirit that helped make Texas the energy capital of the world. I believe this board has an opportunity to demonstrate that Texas can modernize its processes, improve accountability, strengthen reliability, and preserve the trust that's made Texas the most successful electricity market in the world. Thank you for your service, your leadership, and your consideration.
Thank you, Mr. Powell. Any questions for Mr. Powell? Okay. We appreciate you being here today. Thank you for your comments and your additional your written comments and your verbal comments. And we thank you for your investment in Texas. If there's any further discussion on 1325 or 145 before we call for a vote, I don't see any. So I'll entertain a motion to adopt NPR 1325 and to adopt Figure 145 as recommended by TAC in the May 19th, 2026 TAC report, with a recommended effective date of July the 11th for Batch 0 and withdrawal limited private use network and upon system implementation for provisional controllable load resource. Do I have a motion on that? Kathleen, have a second? Julie? Okay. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay. 1325, NPR 1325 and Figure 145 have been adopted. We haven't finished chewing on this enchilada yet. So before we get to the next agenda item, on behalf of the ERCOT board, I want to say thank you to the stakeholder community for the amount of work that's been put into the policy discussions around the Batch Zero framework. You've seen the metrics about, set a record for most comments ever on a stakeholder process. This was a monumental effort to move this type of policy change through the process in less than 4 months. These two revision requests will go down as most commented policy change of ERCOT stakeholder process, as I mentioned. That tells you a lot about the level of interest in such a change, but also the fact that it came to us as a unanimous decision from TAC. I especially want to compliment Caitlin and Martha for the dedication in coordinating all of the stakeholder meetings and for the workshop so that everybody had a voice in the process. To close, I want to further highlight the extraordinary leadership efforts of the ERCOT team and the PUC team in working closely together to develop this change and to address stakeholder comments as effectively and as efficiently as possible. Jeff, Matt, Ajay, Christina, and the rest of the ERCOT team, Barksdale, Jesse, and the rest of the PUC team, you should feel proud of what you have accomplished, and we salute you for it. We're not done, so get strap on for batch one. Board members, any other feedback? Okay. Thank you. Now we have committee reports and agenda item 16. Chris Crummell, chair of the Finance and Audit Committee, will present agenda item 16.1, the Finance and Audit Committee report. Chris, please proceed with your report.
Thank you, Chairman Flores. For the F&A Committee report, we met yesterday. Chad Seeley and staff provided status of reports submitted to ERCOT's ethics point system. Chad also provided the Human Resources Summary Report.
Hey, Chris, I think this would be a public discussion. That seems like the executive session discussion. So
we don't have anything significant to report. I apologize.
That was simple. Peggy Heeg, chair of the chair of the Human Resources and Governance Committee, will present agenda item 16.2, the Human Resources and Governance Committee report. Peggy, please proceed with your report.
Yes, we'll have a very quick report. We had a very light agenda in general session. The only substantive matter that we looked at was the committee self-evaluations that will be going to the various committees for later in the year. That concludes my report.
All right. Next, we have John Swainson, chair of the Technology and Security Committee, who will present agenda item 16.3, the Technology and Security Committee report. John, please proceed.
We had a very full session, which I will attempt to summarize in the spirit that my fellow directors have just done. We started with a discussion of AI infrastructure and large load growth. We had two guest speakers from NVIDIA who talked about work they're doing to architect a technology for these AI data centers that allow them to be load responsive. And you've heard some feedback on that already. It is something that is still in development, but I think it provides more. It's a hopeful development, and I think it provides us with some information that we can start asking large data center large loads about when they come to interconnect to the grid. So that was very helpful. We then had a project update. As you all know, the last year has really, the IT team in particular has been consumed with doing RTC. Now we're sort of back to a normal profile of projects. We have something like 60 in the hopper at the moment. And we looked at those projects. We tried to do some prioritization. They're in the areas of the data center upgrade, which we did talk about, identity access management, and the website upgrade. We had a little bit of a deep dive on the website redesign. The website has been more or less as it is now for about 16 years. And so they've done quite a bit of user-centered design work to understand what would make it more usable by the public at large and market participants. So we went through that, and that'll be coming later this year. We've alluded to two new operational tools, the Large Load Curtailment Manager, which Jeff just talked about, and the RTOC, which I don't remember. It's a real-time communication tool that allows us to talk to market participants and basically coordinate activities, particularly in load shed kind of environments. And so those tools are both being rolled out as we speak throughout the rest of this year. And then we had a general session that looked at next topics. So that concludes my report.
Thank you, John. Any questions for any of the committee chairs on their reports? I don't see any. Okay, at this time, the board will adjourn general session and convene an executive session. Following the executive session, there are two voting items anticipated during the general session. So general session will reconvene at the conclusion of the executive session. At that time, when we reconvene, we'll also have an update regarding board membership. A general session of the ERCOT Board of Directors meeting is now recessed, and the webcast will be concluded. Chair Gleason.
This meeting of the Public Utility Commission of Texas will stand in recess.
So my recommendation is that we grab lunch and try to be back here for executive session in 10 minutes. So that'd be a 13:13. Good afternoon. I'm Bill Flores, ERCOT Board Chair, and I'm hereby reconvening the meeting of the ERCOT Board of Directors. I've confirmed that a quorum is present in person. Before we move on to other business, actually, we don't need to open a PUC meeting. We don't have a quorum there. We have two voting items for agenda item 18, vote on the matters from executive session. First, I'll entertain a motion for board approval of the contract matter discussed during executive session under agenda item ES 2.2.1.
So moved.
Thank you, Bill. And a second? Second for Peggy. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? That matter is approved. Second, I'll entertain a motion for board approval of the litigation matter discussed during executive session under agenda item ES 2.2.2. John, thank you. Second, Julie. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, that matter is also approved. Before we adjourn, I'd like to share an update regarding board membership. Today will be Linda Compiano's last meeting. Linda's term ends at the end of June, and I want to thank her for her 3 years of being part of the ERCOT board and her service to 27 million hard work in Texas. Her ability to cut through the clutter and ask the hard questions has been invaluable to our leadership, and on behalf of the board, we wish her the best of luck. Thank you. This meeting of the ERCOT Board of Directors is now adjourned, and the webcast will be concluded.